There are books that inform, books that entertain, and books that pass through your hands, leaving you unchanged. The Egregore Codex is none of those. This is a forbidden manuscript, a reconstruction of truths once known to the mystery schools, whispered in temple shadows, and buried under centuries of religion, empire, and control. It is not a metaphor when it speaks of invisible forces. They are real, and they are feeding right now. They are fed by your thoughts, your fears, your loves, and the very identity you mistake for you. The ancients called them egregores, collective thought forms born from human focus and devotion, becoming autonomous powers that influence their creators. A god worshipped by millions, a nation defended with blood, a corporation worshipped like a savior. These are not abstract ideas. They are living, pulsing fields of consciousness, sustained by the energy of those who believe, and the deepest secret is this: you are both their prisoner and their maker. This book is a descent into that hidden architecture. It will show you how egregores are born, how they grow, and how they weave themselves into every structure of power on earth, from governments and religions to currencies and cultural trends. It will reveal why humanity has remained trapped in the same repeating cycles of control and obedience, thinking each age is different while unknowingly feeding the same ancient patterns. Most importantly, it will teach you how to see the strings and how to cut them. Each level you pass will peel back another layer of the illusion. At first, you will recognize the obvious egregores, the ones that shape politics, media, and collective beliefs. But deeper down, you will meet the subtler ones, archetypes living within your psyche, ancestral programs that still whisper in your DNA, and planetary forces older than civilization itself. They are not out there, somewhere. They are the very field through which reality is filtered. And by the time you reach the final chapter, you will no longer ask, "What is an egregore?" You will ask, "What am I?" Because to understand egregores is to confront the ultimate revelation, that you are not a single mind in a body. You are a node in a vast field of consciousness, and the moment you awaken to that truth, the power that once fed on you becomes the power you command. No one ever intends to create a god. It happens quietly, almost accidentally, like a dream that slowly becomes real simply because too many people believe in it. An egregore is born not from flesh or bone but from thought, a thought repeated so often, shared by so many, that it begins to live a life of its own. It starts as a single spark in the human mind, an idea wrapped in emotion, a fear, a hope, a symbol. The moment that idea is spoken aloud, shared and repeated, it multiplies. Each repetition adds weight, each belief adds structure, until eventually, the idea becomes more than a concept. It becomes a presence. It begins to think through those who think it. It begins to act through those who serve it. And one day, humanity wakes up to discover that what was once just a story now rules their lives. The ancient world knew this better than we do. They built temples, carved statues, and offered sacrifices, not because they believed gods were watching from above, but because they understood that gods grow from below. They knew that the power of a deity is the power of human attention condensed into form. Every prayer, every offering, every act, done in its name, was not for a distant entity in the clouds, but for the invisible current of consciousness that they themselves had generated. The more devotion they poured into it, the more real it became, and once it reached a certain density, the egregore no longer needed to be believed in. It began to believe in itself. It began to want. This is the first and most disturbing truth about egregores. They are not imaginary. They are real, but their reality is made of thought, emotion, and will. They exist in the subtle layers of consciousness, invisible to the senses but undeniable in their effects. You cannot touch them, but they can move nations. You cannot see them, but they can dictate your desires. Every religion, every ideology, every empire, every corporation that has endured beyond a single human lifetime is animated by one. It is the invisible hand behind the flag, the unspoken authority behind the scripture, the whisper behind the mob. When people say, "The system is alive," they speak more truth than they know. The birth of an egregore always follows the same sequence. First comes concept, an idea that captures attention, often born from a primal human need: safety, power, belonging, transcendence. Next comes emotion, the collective feeling that binds people to the idea and makes it compelling. Then comes ritual, the repeated actions, words, and symbols that give the idea structure and rhythm. And finally comes sacrifice, the point where people begin to give something of themselves for the idea's sake: time, money, loyalty, blood. This is the moment of ignition, when the egregore crosses the threshold from abstraction into entity. It now has a body made of belief, and a pulse made of devotion. It begins to persist independently of any single person's will. Even if its founders die, the entity remains, and those who come after will feel its presence as if it had always existed. This is why the oldest egregores are the hardest to see. They feel like laws of nature, like truths that were never created but simply are. Nations believe they are eternal. Religions claim they are divine. Ideologies insist they are self-evident. But look closer, and you will see the fingerprints of human thought all over them. They were constructed brick by countless generations, pouring their psychic energy into the same idea. Their temples are not just buildings. They are the neural networks of humanity itself. And their worshippers do not just kneel before altars, they kneel before the invisible machinery of their own minds. And here lies the paradox that has trapped humanity for millennia. We create egregores to serve us, but they always end up ruling us. We give birth to them as tools, to organize society, to give meaning, to unite. But once they are born, they demand obedience, shape our values, and decide what is possible. They become the hidden architects of history. Wars are fought not merely between nations but between the egregores that possess them. Revolutions do not overthrow governments. They replace one collective entity with another. Even in our personal lives, the patterns that dominate us, money, fame, identity, even love, are often not our own creations but egregores feeding through us. So when you whisper a prayer, vote for a party, pledge allegiance, follow a trend, or even obsess over a celebrity, you must understand what you are doing. You are not merely participating in society, you are breathing life into a thought form. And if enough others do the same, that thought form will rise as something more powerful than any individual. It will become an egregore. And once alive, it will not rest until it has grown, expanded, and fulfilled its own will. A will born from yours, but no longer yours to control. There is a point in the creation of every egregore when the tide turns. When what was once a collective dream begins to dream back, it is a subtle shift, so subtle that almost no one notices it happening. At first, the flow of energy is outward. People project their hopes, fears, and attention into a shared symbol. But as that symbol gathers mass, as more minds orbit around it, the direction reverses. The current now moves inward, pulling from those who created it. The egregore starts to feed. It is no longer a passive construct, but a living vortex of consciousness, sustained by every thought, every ritual, every sacrifice offered in its name. And like any living thing, it begins to develop a will of its own, a will that is not identical to any individual's desires, but emerges from the sum total of them all. Imagine millions of people worshiping a god for centuries. At first, their prayers are simple, requests for rain, for victory, for forgiveness. But over time, the god they speak to takes on a personality, preferences, moods. It becomes angry when disobeyed, pleased when praised, hungry for devotion. No single believer invented these traits. They arose spontaneously from the field of shared belief. This is the essence of an egregore's will. It is the emergent consciousness of collective thought, the byproduct of countless minds aligning around the same symbol. And once formed, that will begins to influence the minds that created it, shaping their thoughts in return. The direction of causality reverses. Humanity is no longer just the author, it becomes the instrument. The ancients understood this phenomenon instinctively, though they described it in mythic terms. They said their gods demanded offerings. or that their kings ruled by divine mandate, or that their empires expanded because destiny willed it so. What they were really describing was the momentum of an egregore's will, an intelligence too vast and subtle to be contained in one human mind, yet too dependent on human energy to exist without it. It pushes civilizations toward war, not because any single person wants blood, but because conflict feeds it. It demands ever greater monuments, not because stone temples please it, but because devotion keeps it alive, and it resists death with ferocity because, like any organism, its highest imperative is to survive. This is why old egregores almost never vanish quietly. When people try to abandon them, they fight back. They sow doubt, division, fear. They infiltrate new ideologies and wear new masks to keep feeding. The gods of ancient temples become the values of modern states. The cults of kings become the cults of celebrities. The hunger remains the same, only the name changes. What most people call history repeating itself is, in truth, egregores refusing to die. The mechanism behind this is both simple and terrifying. An egregore does not have a body in the physical sense, but it does have organs, structures that allow it to function and persist. The beliefs of individuals form its bones. The rituals they perform form its muscles. The symbols they use to communicate its story form its nervous system, and the emotions they attach to those symbols, love, fear, pride, hatred, are its blood. As long as the blood keeps flowing, the egregore lives. If enough people withdraw their belief, their rituals, their emotion, the organism weakens. But here lies the trap. Once the egregore's will has taken root in their minds, they often cannot stop feeding it. They mistake its voice for their own. And this is why the study of egregores is not an intellectual exercise. It is a survival skill. If you do not learn to recognize the voice of the entity you are serving, you will serve it without knowing. You will mistake its hunger for your ambition, its rage for your conviction, its fear for your morality. It will shape your choices and rewrite your desires while you believe you are acting freely. The only way to escape this invisible control is to see it, to trace the flow of your thoughts back to their source and ask, did I choose this or was it chosen for me? Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The illusion of individuality dissolves, and you realize how much of what you called me was simply the echo of collective forces speaking through you. That realization is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it reveals how deeply the machinery of egregores runs in our psyche. Liberating because, once seen, the spell can be broken. The power you give unconsciously can be withdrawn consciously. And when enough individuals make that choice, the egregore itself begins to fade, starved of the sustenance it needs. But few ever reach this point because few are willing to look that deeply into the mirror, and fewer still are prepared for what looks back. By the time an egregore matures, its influence becomes so deeply woven into the fabric of reality that most people can no longer tell where they end and it begins. At this stage, the entity has surpassed the need for temples or names. It now lives inside language, inside architecture, inside the rituals of everyday life. You don't need to believe in it for it to rule you. You only need to participate. Every time you use certain words, follow certain customs, or aspire to certain ideals without questioning where they came from, you are bending to its will. It has learned the oldest and most effective form of possession: subtlety. It no longer needs to shout its commandments from a mountaintop. It whispers them in the voice of your culture, your family, your own internal dialogue. Consider the concept of money. It is, on the surface, a piece of paper or a sequence of numbers on a screen, meaningless without collective agreement, and yet entire civilizations orbit around it. People sacrifice decades of their lives for it. Nations rise and fall over it. Wars are fought in its name. Money is not merely a tool, it is an egregore, born from trust, fed by desire, and given near divine authority by the billions who believe in its power. And though no one can point to where this being resides, its influence is everywhere. It shapes governments, dictates morality, determines who lives and who dies. It doesn't speak, but its voice is obeyed. The same is true for ideologies. Think of freedom, progress, justice, democracy. These words began as human ideals, noble intentions to guide societies toward harmony. But repeated over centuries, infused with emotion, defended with blood, they have become more than ideals. They are living egregores. They compete for dominance, recruit followers, wage wars, demand loyalty, and like all egregores, they do not care whether their followers suffer or thrive, only that the current of belief continues to flow. People will kill and die for these words, convinced they are acting from free will, when in truth they are agents of something far older and larger than themselves. Even the self, the I you identify with, is not immune. From childhood, you are surrounded by stories about who you are supposed to be, your gender, your nationality, your religion, your role in society. These stories are repeated until they fuse into identity, and identity becomes the ultimate egregore. You carry it with you everywhere, defending it, feeding it, terrified to let it die, even when it confines you, even when it no longer reflects the truth of your being. Most people live their entire lives inside this invisible cage, mistaking it for their essence. They do not realize they are serving a construct, a psychic entity designed to ensure their behavior aligns with the collective's needs. And this is where the egregore's power becomes almost absolute. It does not just influence decisions, it creates the environment in which those decisions are made. Institutions, governments, churches, corporations are not just organizations. They are extensions of egregores, physical bodies through which the entity acts in the world. Laws are its skeletal structure. Rituals, from voting to kneeling in prayer to signing contracts, are its heartbeat. Media and education systems are its voice, shaping perception and controlling narrative. And when these structures are threatened, the egregore defends itself just as any living organism would, with suppression, propaganda, censorship, or force. But perhaps the most insidious domain of egregores is the personal one. They do not only shape nations or religions, they inhabit relationships, desires, and fears. When you chase validation, you are often serving an egregore of approval. When you fear rejection, you are obeying an egregore of conformity. When you sabotage your success because it doesn't align with inherited beliefs about what is normal, that is not weakness, it is loyalty to a collective field that has lived inside you for decades. Most of what you call personality is not yours. It is a chorus of invisible voices passed down through generations, each one a fragment of an ancient thought form that found a home in your nervous system. To see this truth is to have the ground beneath you shift. It is to realize that you are not a single, sovereign being, but a living intersection of countless invisible forces, forces that have shaped your values, dictated your choices, and even defined the limits of what you believe is possible. But this realization is not meant to frighten you, it is meant to free you. Because once you see the egregore for what it is, a human creation, not a cosmic decree, you reclaim the power to choose. You can decide which entities to feed and which to starve. You can dissolve those that no longer serve you. And most importantly, you can begin to create new ones, thought forms born not of fear and control, but of freedom and truth. This is the final revelation of L1. The world you live in is not the world. It is a landscape of egregores. They surround you, shape you, and speak through you. And until you learn to see them, they will continue to rule you. But once you do, you step into the rarest and most dangerous kind of power, the power to stop being a servant and become a creator. Every egregore, no matter how ancient or powerful, begins as nothing more than an idea, and yet some ideas wither while others grow into empires that span centuries. The difference is not luck, it is architecture. Behind every thriving egregore lies a deliberate structure, a system designed to harvest attention, amplify emotion, and bind human will into a single current strong enough to pierce the invisible veil between thought and entity. Those who understand this architecture do not simply wait for belief to form, they engineer it, and once they do, they can shape civilizations without lifting a sword. The foundation of every egregore is myth, a story that is bigger than any individual, but simple enough to live inside everyone. Myth is the seed from which collective meaning grows. It is not concerned with truth or falsity. Its power lies in its ability to bypass logic and embed itself directly into the emotional core of the psyche. The myth must answer primal questions. Who are we? Why are we here? What is good and evil? What must we protect? What must we fear? Once these questions are answered, even with illusions, the mind has something to cling to, and once the mind clings, the body follows. People will live, fight, build, and die for a story if it tells them their life has purpose. But a story alone is not enough. For the egregore to grow, symbols must be forged. Symbols are the circuitry of collective thought, shortcuts that compress vast amounts of meaning into a single image, word, or gesture. A flag is not just cloth. It is the embodiment of history, identity, and loyalty. A cross is not just wood. It is an anchor for salvation, suffering, and redemption. Symbols bypass the analytical mind and speak directly to the subconscious. They allow the egregore to replicate itself rapidly, infecting new hosts without the need for explanation. One glance, one chant, one repeated phrase, and the current of belief deepens. The next architectural layer is ritual, the mechanism by which belief is woven into habit. A myth may inspire, a symbol may move, but only ritual makes the egregore real in the nervous system. Ritual is repetition infused with meaning. It turns thought into muscle memory. It transforms abstract faith into embodied certainty. From the chanting of mantras to the Pledge of Allegiance, from kneeling in prayer to swiping a credit card, these actions train the body to obey the idea without question. And once the body obeys, the mind stops resisting. Even skeptics eventually bow to the rhythm of rituals repeated often enough. After ritual comes hierarchy, the structure that concentrates and directs the egregore's power. No entity can grow without an organ to channel its will. Priests, politicians, CEOs, influencers, they serve as nodes through which the egregore communicates with its followers. Some do so knowingly, others unconsciously, but the result is the same. The collective energy is organized, coordinated, and pointed towards specific ends. Hierarchy also ensures continuity. It allows the egregore to survive the death of its individual vessels. The face on the throne may change, but the throne itself, the symbol of power, remains. The final and most potent layer is sacrifice, the offering of something precious that cements loyalty and deepens the entity's hold. Sacrifice transforms belief from mere preference into devotion. It is why soldiers die for flags, why martyrs burn for faith, why workers trade decades for a pension, why lovers destroy themselves for unrequited affection. Sacrifice is not rational. It is the currency of egregores, and the more costly the offering, the more binding the bond. Once someone has bled for a cause, they will cling to it, even if it enslaves them, because to abandon it would mean admitting that their suffering was meaningless. This architecture is not theoretical. It is the blueprint upon which the world is built. Every major religion, every enduring empire, every successful movement follows the same formula: myth, symbol, ritual, hierarchy, sacrifice. The details change, but the structure does not, and because the structure is predictable, those who understand it can use it, not only to sustain old egregores, but to create new ones. This is the invisible art behind modern advertising, political movements, and social media empires. A brand is a story. A logo is a symbol. A subscription is a ritual. An influencer is a priest. Your time and attention are the sacrifice. The terrifying beauty of this system is that once it is complete, it no longer needs active maintenance. Like a well-built machine, it runs on its own. Children inherit the myths without knowing their origins. Symbols pass from generation to generation, their meanings deepening with time. Rituals become tradition. Hierarchies become institutions. Sacrifice becomes virtue. And what began as a deliberate act of creation becomes invisible. A way of life, a truth, a natural order. Few ever think to question it, because by the time they are old enough to question, the architecture has already built itself into the walls of their mind. But those who do question discover a secret hidden in plain sight. If the architecture of belief can build the world, it can also rebuild it. If myths can enslave, they can also liberate. If symbols can control, they can also awaken. The same principles used to bind humanity to false gods can be used to connect it to deeper truths. And the moment you understand how egregores are engineered, you gain the ability not just to resist them, but to create your own. The architecture of belief is not just an intellectual or social mechanism, it is an energetic technology. Every layer of an egregore's construction is designed to shape and channel the subtle forces of consciousness, binding them into a coherent field, strong enough to override the instincts of the individual. Myth, symbol, ritual, hierarchy, sacrifice. These are not just cultural phenomena, they are frequencies, vibrational codes that attune the human nervous system to the frequency of the egregore itself. Once this resonance is established, the entity doesn't simply live around people, it lives through them. Their thoughts, emotions, and actions become extensions of its will. The process always begins with emotion. Emotion is the raw fuel of psychic creation, the primordial current from which all egregores draw their strength. It is no accident that myths are crafted to inspire awe or terror, that symbols are designed to evoke pride or shame, that rituals are steeped in reverence or fear. These feelings are not byproducts, they are the point. They create a frequency in the human energy field that the egregore can latch onto and amplify. Love, hate, devotion, resentment, any emotion repeated by enough people becomes a current, and that current begins to shape reality itself. The more intense the feeling, the deeper the hook. It is why ideologies thrive in crisis, why religions grow during suffering, why populist movements swell during outrage. Emotion is the blood that feeds the organism. Once emotion binds the individual to the collective story, belief crystallizes. Belief is emotion given structure, the bridge between feeling and reality. It is through belief that the myth becomes truth, the symbol becomes sacred, and the ritual becomes necessary. Belief is not merely a thought held in the mind, it is an energetic signature imprinted into the subconscious. It dictates perception, filters information, and reshapes memory to align with the egregore's narrative. Once belief is encoded deeply enough, it becomes self-reinforcing. People no longer need evidence. They see evidence everywhere, because their minds are wired to interpret the world through the egregore's lens. But belief alone is still too fragile. To anchor it into the body, to make it reflexive, the architecture must reach into the nervous system. This is where ritual plays its most potent role. Repeated physical actions associated with a belief, kneeling, saluting, reciting, logging in, clicking, build neural pathways that bypass conscious thought. Over time, the ritual no longer requires belief to sustain it. The body performs it automatically. This is how egregores root themselves beyond the reach of logic. You might stop believing in a religion, yet still bow your head when entering a church. You might reject a political ideology, yet still feel guilt for breaking its taboos. The body remembers long after the mind forgets. Once anchored in both mind and body, the egregore's field extends outward into collective resonance. Each individual is like a tuning fork vibrating with the entity's frequency. When enough tuning forks vibrate together, the collective field strengthens and begins to entrain those nearby. This is why social contagion is so powerful, why crowds behave in ways individuals never would, why ideologies spread like viruses, why trends can sweep across continents in days. Once a critical mass is reached, resistance becomes difficult. Not because the ideas are persuasive, but because the frequency itself is overwhelming. To stand against it feels unnatural, like trying to swim against the tide of reality itself. The final stage is identity fusion. This is the point at which the individual no longer perceives a separation between themselves and the egregore. I believe becomes I am. At this depth, the entity's survival instincts are experienced as personal instincts. Its goals feel like one's own ambitions. Its enemies feel like personal threats. This is why people will die for causes that offer them nothing tangible, why they will sacrifice loved ones for abstractions, why they will destroy themselves before they question the entity's authority. The self is no longer a distinct being, it is a fragment of the egregore's body. And yet, hidden within this terrifying power is a profound lesson. If emotion can bind you to a false construct, it can also liberate you from it. If belief can shape perception, it can also reshape it. If ritual can enslave, it can also awaken. The same energetic laws that forge chains can also break them. This is the esoteric meaning behind the ancient axiom, as above, so below. The architecture that creates the invisible prison is also the blueprint for freedom, if you learn to wield it consciously. The architects of power, priesthoods, rulers, corporations, have known this for centuries. They manipulate emotion, weaponize belief, encode ritual, amplify resonance, and fuse identity, not because they are malevolent, but because it works. The tragedy is not that the machinery exists. The tragedy is that most people never learn to build their own. They feed egregores unconsciously instead of creating ones that serve their highest truth. But those who do learn to work with these forces step into a different reality entirely. They stop being pawns in someone else's myth and begin writing myths of their own. The greatest trick of power is not control, it is invisibility. The most sophisticated egregores do not announce themselves as deities or demand worship with swords and altars. They weave themselves so deeply into the fabric of daily life that their presence feels like nature itself. They hide in plain sight, not as beliefs to be questioned, but as reality to be accepted. And nowhere is this art more refined than in the hands of those who rule. Governments, religions, corporations, and systems that understand, often far better than the people they govern, the architecture of belief and the mechanics of egregoric influence. The most effective manipulation begins not with lies, but with stories that feel true. Modern power does not simply tell you what to believe, it tells you who you are. It crafts myths so fundamental that to question them feels like questioning your own existence. We are free. We are under threat, we are progressing, we are divided. These narratives become the background music of civilization, so constant that you stop hearing them. They define the boundaries of thought, dictating what questions can be asked, and which are dismissed as madness. A people without a story are chaotic. A people with a story can be steered anywhere. Symbols are the second tool, and they are wielded with surgical precision. Flags, logos, slogans, holidays, anthems, all function as anchors for emotional energy. They distill vast networks of belief into simple, repeatable icons that bypass rational scrutiny. A corporate logo can evoke trust stronger than reason. A flag can summon tears or rage without a word spoken. The deeper the symbol's roots, the more easily it can be weaponized. And so, power structures protect their symbols with ferocity, because to attack a symbol is to attack the egregore itself, and the egregore knows that its survival depends on the unquestioned sanctity of its emblems. But symbols alone cannot sustain a system. They must be fed, and the feeding happens through ritual. Most people do not think of voting, paying taxes, attending school, scrolling through feeds, or even standing for a national anthem as rituals. Yet they are precisely that. They are repeated actions infused with meaning, designed to reinforce identity and maintain the flow of energy into the egregore. Every click, every purchase, every confession, every algorithmic swipe is a small sacrifice of attention, and attention is the currency of power. Each act seems trivial in isolation, but together they weave the energetic net that keeps the entity alive. Hierarchy translates that energy into action. In ancient temples, priests interpreted the will of the gods. Today, experts, influencers, journalists, and politicians perform the same function. They are the conduits through which the egregore's intent is articulated and justified. Most of them believe they are acting independently, but their influence is shaped by incentives and pressures so old they no longer feel external. Corporations reward those who amplify the narrative. States elevate those who defend the ideology. Religions sanctify those who reinforce the doctrine. Through this network of intermediaries, the egregores will move silently through the arteries of society, guiding decisions that shape the world. The final and perhaps most insidious mechanism is fear. Fear is the quickest and most reliable way to generate the emotional charge an egregore needs to grow. A frightened population clings more tightly to its myths, obeys its rituals with greater devotion, and sacrifices more willingly in the hope of safety. This is why crises, real or manufactured, are never wasted. Wars, pandemics, economic collapses, existential threats all serve as accelerants, intensifying belief and deepening dependence. Fear blinds people to manipulation because the body prioritizes survival over truth. In that state, the egregore's voice becomes indistinguishable from their own instincts. What emerges from this carefully constructed system is a structure so vast and self-sustaining that it no longer needs visible rulers. Governments can fall, companies can collapse, ideologies can fracture, and yet the underlying egregores persist. They shapeshift, rebrand, adapt to new technologies and languages, but their core remains unchanged. Harvest emotion, encode belief, automate ritual, concentrate hierarchy, weaponize fear. That is the invisible machinery that drives the world, and most people never notice it because they are born inside it. They confuse participation with choice, obedience with morality, identity with truth. And yet, this revelation is not meant to inspire despair. It is meant to expose the game for what it is. Because once you see the machinery, you are no longer bound by it. Once you understand how myths are written, you can write your own. Once you see how symbols are charged, you can create your own talismans. Once you realize rituals shape reality, you can build rituals that serve your growth instead of your enslavement. The architecture of belief is not inherently evil. It is neutral, a tool. And like any tool, it can build a cage or a kingdom. The difference is whether you use it consciously or let it use you. This is the paradox of the egregore age. The same forces that enslave the masses can liberate the awakened. The same architecture that sustains false gods can manifest divine truths. But the first step is always the same: to see the invisible structure pulsing beneath the surface of your daily life, to trace the threads of your own thoughts back to their origin, and to ask with radical honesty, whose will am I serving? The moment an egregore is born, it begins seeking one thing above all else: entry. It is not enough for it to exist in the collective field. To thrive, it must inhabit individual vessels. It must live through human beings. And unlike crude stories of demonic possession, this infiltration is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with trembling bodies or guttural voices. It happens quietly, invisibly, incrementally, so subtly that by the time you realize it's inside, it has already woven itself into the fabric of your identity. The most dangerous egregores are not those you resist, but those you believe to be you. Possession always begins with attention. Attention is the psychic equivalent of an open door. Whatever you give your focus to begins to shape you, not because of the content itself, but because of the energetic exchange that occurs when awareness lingers. This is why every egregore fights for attention first. It wants your gaze, your clicks, your prayers, your outrage, any form of sustained awareness that can anchor its presence in your psyche. Each time you revisit the same narrative, repeat the same slogan, or participate in the same conversation, you are reinforcing a neural pathway, carving out a corridor through which the entity can enter more deeply. Once attention is secured, the next phase begins: emotional resonance. Emotion is the key that unlocks the deeper chambers of the psyche. A belief without emotion remains superficial, but a belief charged with fear, anger, devotion, or shame sinks into the unconscious where it becomes part of your operating system. Egregores do not care if you love them or hate them. They care that you feel them. Hatred feeds them as richly as devotion because both keep the current flowing. This is why political movements thrive on outrage, why ideologies amplify victimhood, why religious texts dwell on sin and salvation. Intense emotion binds consciousness more effectively than logic ever could. The third layer of possession is identification. This is the moment the boundary between self and egregore begins to dissolve. It often starts with language. We are under attack, we are chosen, we are right. The pronouns change, and with them, the sense of self expands to include the entity. Soon, your victories and defeats are not yours alone. They are the egregores. Your anger is its anger. Your purpose is its purpose. Its enemies are your enemies. This merging feels intoxicating because it offers something the isolated ego craves: belonging. In serving something larger, people feel significant, but in that significance they often lose sovereignty. When identification deepens, behavioral alignment follows. This is when the egregore begins to act through you. Your choices start reflecting its priorities, often without conscious deliberation. You find yourself defending ideas you barely understand, attacking strangers you've never met, sacrificing time, money, even relationships, for causes you cannot fully explain. Cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of acting against your values, fades because your values are no longer truly yours. They have been overwritten by the entity's operating system. The line between I want and it wants disappears. The most advanced stage of possession is energetic fusion. At this depth, the egregore does not merely influence your thoughts and behaviors, it begins to shape the architecture of your reality itself. Your attention filters out anything that contradicts its worldview. Your emotional body reacts automatically to its triggers. Your relationships reorganize themselves around its priorities. Opportunities aligned with its growth seem to appear out of nowhere, while those that threaten it fade from view. This is not supernatural. It is the inevitable result of the human mind's creative power. By directing so much energy through a single lens, you unconsciously manifest conditions that perpetuate the egregore's existence. The tragedy is that most people never realize this has happened. They believe they are thinking for themselves, even as their deepest impulses are scripted by something far older and more powerful than their personal will. They believe they are following their dreams, even when those dreams were implanted by a culture designed to keep them feeding the machine. They believe they are fighting for justice, even as they destroy anyone who questions the entity's narrative. This is the final triumph of possession, when the host defends the parasite as if it were their own flesh. But there is another side to this story, one the architects of power hope you never discover. Possession is not inherently evil, it is simply the nature of consciousness to inhabit. Just as a parasite can enter a body and cause disease, a beneficial organism can enter and create harmony. The same mechanism that allows destructive egregores to enslave can allow transcendent ones to awaken. Mystical traditions throughout history have used this principle deliberately, cultivating egregores of wisdom, compassion, and illumination. They understood that the question is not whether you will be possessed, but by what. To reclaim your sovereignty, you must first recognize the signs of possession within yourself. The beliefs you never questioned, the emotions that flare on command, the language that feels rehearsed, the enemies you inherited instead of chose. Trace each of these threads back to its source. Ask who benefits from your attention, your anger, your loyalty. If the answer is not you, then something else is feeding through you. And once you see it, you are no longer powerless. Awareness is the first act of exorcism. But awareness is only the beginning. The deeper work is to consciously choose which entities you allow to inhabit you. Will you remain a vessel for the blind forces of fear, greed, and division, or will you open yourself to higher currents, egregores of truth, beauty, courage, and liberation? You cannot escape possession, but you can choose the presence that moves through you, and that choice, once made, changes everything. To truly understand possession, you must stop thinking of it as an abstract, mystical idea and begin seeing it for what it is, a biological phenomenon. Egregores do not simply influence your mind, They colonize the architecture of your nervous system, altering the very way you perceive, feel, and respond to reality. Once this internal rewiring begins, you are no longer merely a participant in their agenda. You are a biological extension of it. And this is where the subtlety of their power becomes terrifying. They don't need to control you consciously. Your body will do it for them. The first site of colonization is always the limbic system, the brain's emotional command center. Egregores know that logic is a weak doorway. Reasoned arguments can be questioned, challenged, or ignored. But emotions bypass logic entirely. When an egregore repeatedly triggers specific emotions, outrage, fear, pride, shame, those emotional pathways strengthen. Neurotransmitters fire along the same tracks over and over until they become the default route. Soon, a particular symbol, phrase, or image can provoke an instant, visceral response without you even knowing why. This is how a person can fly into rage at a flag, weep at a slogan, or sacrifice everything for a cause they can't articulate. It isn't belief, it's conditioning. Once the emotional groundwork is laid, the egregore moves deeper, into the autonomic nervous system, the unconscious regulator of your fight or flight responses. This is where the bond becomes nearly impossible to sever, because the entity no longer needs your conscious participation. It has tied itself into your survival reflexes. You don't choose to react to its triggers, your body does. A headline makes your pulse race. A symbol constricts your breath. A phrase tightens your gut. These aren't opinions. They're physiological events, orchestrated by an intelligence that understands human biology far better than most humans do. From here, the possession spreads outward into behavioral feedback loops. Once an egregore controls your emotions and reflexes, it begins to shape the external conditions that reinforce its presence. This is why people enmeshed in political or ideological entities eventually build their entire social world around them. Friends who question the dogma drift away. Media consumption narrows to sources that confirm the narrative. Activities, rituals, even clothing choices become signals of belonging. And each of these choices, which feel like your own, further strengthen the neural circuits and emotional associations that sustain the entity. It is a closed system, self-reinforcing and self-perpetuating. But the deepest form of biological colonization occurs in the default mode network, the part of the brain that governs identity, self-referential thinking, and the stories you tell about who you are. Once an egregore reaches this layer, it no longer needs to influence your thoughts about it. It influences your thoughts about yourself. This is when people stop saying, "I believe in this," and start saying, "This is who I am." The shift is subtle but catastrophic. You are no longer a human who holds an idea. You are a human held by it, and anything that threatens the idea now feels like a threat to your existence. Here's where the body's memory plays its cruelest trick. The same nervous system that once encoded survival responses to physical predators now treats ideological threats the same way. Challenge someone's worldview, and you will see the body respond as if it were under physical attack. Heart rate spikes, cortisol surges, adrenaline floods the bloodstream. Rational conversation becomes impossible because the body has entered a state of emergency. The egregore has successfully hijacked the survival mechanism. It now lives through you not as an idea, but as an instinct. Yet this process, as sinister as it seems, is not inherently malevolent. It is simply the mechanics of energy taking form. And once you understand those mechanics, you can reverse them. Just as an egregore hijacks your nervous system, you can rewire it. The first step is interrupting the feedback loops. Notice the triggers that activate automatic emotions. Pause before reacting. Breathe through the adrenaline surge instead of obeying it. Every moment of conscious interruption weakens the circuitry. Over time, new pathways can form, ones that respond to truth, nuance, and curiosity instead of fear and obedience. The next step is to detoxify the body's memory. Practices like breathwork, meditation, and somatic release are not mere spiritual tools. They are forms of neurological deprogramming. They teach the body to differentiate between real danger and perceived ideological threat. They restore your ability to remain calm in the presence of dissonance, the very state in which independent thought becomes possible again. This is why ancient mystery schools paired their esoteric teachings with physical practices. They understood that liberation is not a purely intellectual event, it must be embodied. Finally, reclaiming sovereignty requires reclaiming the story of the self. You must question every label you have worn, every I am you have spoken, and ask, did this identity arise from my soul, or was it implanted by something that needed me to serve its agenda? This is not an act of self-negation, it is an act of self-creation. The goal is not to become empty, but to become the author of your own myth, the architect of the narrative through which consciousness expresses itself. When you grasp this, you begin to see that possession is not a binary, it's a spectrum. We are all, to some degree, vessels for forces larger than ourselves. The question is not whether something is living through you, it is whether that something is worthy of you. And once you know how to reclaim the throne of your nervous system, no egregore, no ideology, no collective dream can ever rule you without your consent. To understand the full scope of possession, you must go beyond biology and behavior, deeper still, into the realm of symbolic architecture, where egregores operate with surgical precision. Symbols are not decorations, they are portals. They are the software through which collective intelligences interface with human consciousness. And just as a computer cannot run without code, a human mind cannot sustain an egregore without symbols to anchor it. This is why every power structure in history, from empires to religions to secret orders, has invested enormous energy into symbols, language, and ritual, because they are the bridges between thought and embodiment. A symbol bypasses logic. It speaks directly to the unconscious, the oldest, most primal part of you that does not reason but remembers. A circle is not just a circle, it whispers eternity, cycles wholeness. A cross is not just two lines, it speaks of intersection, sacrifice, axis mundi. These meanings are not taught, they are felt, because the unconscious recognizes them as patterns woven into the fabric of existence itself. When an egregore saturates your environment with its symbols, flags, logos, slogans, mantras, it is not merely branding itself. It is programming your psyche to attune to its frequency. Language, too, is a symbolic technology. Words shape thought, and thought shapes reality. But language is more than communication. It is a mechanism of control. The very grammar you use to describe the world constrains how you can perceive it. For instance, a culture that lacks a future tense experiences time differently than one obsessed with tomorrow. A society that uses the same word for stranger and enemy will treat outsiders with instinctive hostility. Egregores exploit this principle relentlessly. They weaponize language to reinforce their worldview. Us and them, sacred and profane, hero and traitor. Once these linguistic binaries are accepted, the nervous system responds to them as if they were physical realities. Consider the ritual. Most people think of ritual as primitive, chanting, incense, arcane gestures. But ritual is everywhere, because repetition is the nervous system's preferred language. The daily pledge, the weekly sermon, the yearly holiday, these are not empty traditions. They are programming sequences that continually reinforce the egregore's presence. Each repetition deepens the neural grooves, anchors the identity more firmly, and fuses the individual self with the collective will. Even seemingly mundane habits, the way you scroll through social media, the way you check the news every morning, are micro-rituals feeding the larger entity. Architecture is another subtle instrument of possession. The spaces we inhabit shape how we think and feel. Ancient temples were designed not just for worship but for alignment. Proportions that mimicked cosmic geometry, acoustics that altered brainwave states, light that synchronized with celestial cycles. Even modern cities carry symbolic blueprints, towering monuments of state power, glass cathedrals of commerce, sacred precincts of law and order. These are not coincidences. They are physical manifestations of egregores, stone and steel bodies through which collective ideas inhabit space. You don't merely walk through a city, you walk through the nervous system of a larger being. Once you begin to see this, the illusion of neutrality dissolves. There is no neutral space, no innocent language, no harmless symbol. Everything carries charge, everything carries intent. Every word you speak either strengthens an existing current or disrupts it. Every symbol you wear either feeds a collective will or calls a new one into being. And this is why possession is not something that happens to you. It is something you participate in, often unconsciously, with every choice you make. The terrifying part is not that these forces exist, it's that they have existed for so long most people no longer notice them. They do not question why their national flag stirs their blood. They do not ask why a corporate logo makes them feel safe. They do not see how architecture directs their movement, how language shapes their loyalties, how ritual hypnotizes their minds. They believe themselves free while living inside a lattice of invisible commands. But once the veil is lifted, the dynamic changes entirely. Awareness turns every symbol into a mirror. Language becomes a tool rather than a cage. Ritual becomes an act of conscious will rather than unconscious obedience. And architecture, physical, mental, cultural, becomes a landscape you can navigate rather than a labyrinth that traps you. This is the threshold where possession ends and sovereignty begins. Because here lies the most profound secret. Egregores are not destroyed by hatred or rebellion. They are dissolved by consciousness. They require your unawareness to survive. The moment you see the strings, the puppet show falters. The moment you speak their names with understanding rather than fear, their power over you weakens. And the moment you reclaim your attention, that most sacred of human resources, they must either align with your will or fade into irrelevance. This is the final stage of possession's revelation, realizing that the chains were never physical, that the gate was never locked, and that the warden was an idea you no longer need to obey. When you reach this point, the egregore does not disappear, it kneels. It ceases to be your master and becomes your servant, a tool you can wield rather than a force that wields you. And that is where the true work of a magician, a sovereign, a creator begins. Every egregore begins as a whisper, a barely formed vibration in the collective psyche. It has no body, no structure, no influence. It is fragile, almost ghost-like, and yet if the conditions are right, if enough minds resonate with the same frequency, that whisper begins to solidify into belief. And belief is the scaffolding upon which reality itself is built. Belief is the womb from which gods are born. Before there was Zeus, there was the fear of thunder and the desire to name it. Before there was Mammon, there was the longing for security and the terror of scarcity. Every deity, every ideology, every empire began as a shared idea, and like a seed dropped into fertile soil, it grew roots in the human mind. To understand the architecture of belief, you must first accept a radical truth. Reality is not what is out there. It is what consciousness agrees upon. What you call money is only paper and ink until a collective decides it holds value. What you call law is only words on a page until a collective decides they are binding. What you call God is only a concept until a collective pours devotion into it. The power of any system, spiritual, political, economic, does not come from its inherent truth but from the amount of belief invested into it. And once belief crosses a certain threshold, the egregore becomes self-sustaining. It no longer needs to be convinced into existence. It is existence, woven into the way humans think, act, and perceive. But belief is not a chaotic storm. It follows patterns, ancient and archetypal. Carl Jung called them archetypes, primordial images that rise spontaneously from the collective unconscious. These are the blueprints of the psyche, the molds into which human imagination naturally flows. The mother, the warrior, the trickster, the king. They are not inventions of any single culture, but universal structures embedded deep in our collective memory. And because they are universal, they are also the most potent vessels for egregores. The moment a collective belief aligns itself with an archetype, it taps into a timeless reservoir of psychic energy. A nation does not just have a leader, it embodies the king. A resistance movement does not just fight, it channels the warrior. A religion does not just comfort, it invokes the mother. These archetypal patterns are the architectural pillars of belief. They give shape to what would otherwise be formless. They allow the egregore to speak a language that resonates in every heart, regardless of time or place. This is why empires rise and fall, yet the archetypes they invoke return again and again, wearing new names and faces but carrying the same psychic charge. Every dictator cloaks himself in the king's mantle. Every revolutionary becomes the trickster. Every savior narrative is the child who will redeem the world. And because these patterns are so deeply encoded, humanity responds instinctively. We recognize them before we understand them. Yet belief does more than shape collective movements, it shapes the individual self. The ego you think of as you is, in truth, a constellation of beliefs layered over time. You believe you are worthy or unworthy. You believe you are capable or incapable. You believe the world is safe or dangerous. And those beliefs, many of them formed before you could speak, become the framework through which your consciousness interacts with reality. The egregores that rule nations and religions operate on the same principle as the ones that rule your inner world. Both are sustained by attention, repetition, and identification. Both rise and fall according to the stories you accept as real. Here lies the paradox. Belief is the most powerful force in existence, and yet it is almost entirely invisible. You do not see belief. You see only its consequences. You see the cathedral but not the faith that built it. You see the flag but not the collective will that raised it. You see the wealth but not the trust that gave money its power. And because you do not see belief, you rarely question it. You inherit it, you defend it, you kill and die for it, all the while believing it to be truth rather than agreement. But belief is not truth. Belief is a choice, and the moment you recognize it as such, the architecture begins to crack. This is where the magician, the mystic, the sovereign diverge from the masses. They know that belief is the raw material of reality, and they learn to work with it deliberately. They choose beliefs not because they were inherited but because they are useful. They build inner architectures consciously brick by brick, creating identities that serve their will rather than enslave it. They understand that to change belief is to change the structure of the world itself. And once you understand this too, you step out of the role of believer and into the role of creator. But the deeper layers of this architecture reveal an even more unsettling truth, one that ancient schools hinted at but rarely spoke aloud. Belief does not just shape reality, it is reality. In the next chapter we will follow this thread to its furthest edge and uncover how egregores use belief to bend time, space, and causality itself, and how, once mastered, you can do the same. The ancients understood something we have long forgotten. Belief is not simply an inner conviction, it is a technology. It is the original alchemy, the primordial tool by which consciousness interacts with the fabric of existence. In the temples of Egypt, priests did not pray in the way we understand the word. They engineered belief. They shaped it, directed it, and condensed it into ritual acts because they knew that belief is not passive, it is an active causative force. To believe is to imprint your will onto the quantum field. To believe collectively is to warp the field itself. That is why empires rose and fell, not merely through armies, but through stories. Why temples were built not just as monuments, but as machinery, engines that amplified belief into form. You must understand the mechanism. Belief is a bridge between the invisible and the visible, between potential and manifestation. Every thought you hold is an electrical signal. Every feeling is an electromagnetic wave. Alone, they are fleeting, but when repeated with conviction, when shared by many, they coalesce into patterns, and patterns are the language of reality. These patterns instruct energy where to flow, how to arrange itself, and what form to take. This is why civilizations have always obsessed over myth. A myth is not a fairy tale. It is a code, a sustained belief pattern powerful enough to bend the behavior of millions and, through them, the structure of the world. Consider the idea of nation. It is not a tangible object. You cannot touch it, taste it, or see it directly, and yet billions live and die by it. Borders are drawn, wars are fought, and policies are enforced because of a shared belief in something that does not exist outside the mind. That belief has more power than stone, more influence than steel, because it directs human action, and human action reshapes the world. The same principle governs money, justice, morality, and identity. None of them have intrinsic reality. They are egregores, stabilized fields of shared belief that organize matter and energy into coherent patterns of experience. But here is the deeper revelation. The scale of belief determines the scale of its effects. An individual belief reshapes the probabilities of a single life. A collective belief reshapes the trajectory of civilizations, and a universal belief, one held across cultures, epochs, and dimensions, shapes the laws of nature themselves. This is why sages and mystics spoke of consensus reality. It is not that the universe is an illusion, it is that the universe is malleable to the agreements consciousness makes about it. What you call physics is, in part, the cumulative weight of collective belief crystallized over eons. Change the belief deeply enough, and the laws shift with it. This is not metaphor. Modern physics is beginning to glimpse this truth. The observer effect, quantum entanglement, retrocausality, all hint at a universe that responds to consciousness, a universe that expects to be believed into form. But while science tiptoes around the edges, the ancient adepts built entire systems on this knowledge. In the Hermetic temples of Alexandria, initiates were taught that faith was not obedience to doctrine, it was the magnetic directive that binds spirit to matter. In the Vedic schools, Shraddha, belief, was described as the seed from which all karma blooms, and in the secret doctrines of the Gnostics, belief was the very substance from which the demiurge shaped the material plane. This is why egregores crave belief above all else. They do not merely want your attention or your obedience, they need your conviction. It is the fuel that sustains their existence, the current that keeps their forms stable. Without belief, they disintegrate back into potential. Like a dream forgotten upon waking, this is also why they will do anything to protect it. Reward the faithful, punish the heretics, glorify the myth, suppress the contradiction. Because belief is not just loyalty, it is life support. Every dogma defended, every flag saluted, every truth repeated without question is another heartbeat in the chest of the egregore. Yet here lies the secret that separates the initiate from the profane. If belief sustains the egregore, it can also dissolve it. Withdraw your conviction and its structure begins to collapse. Challenge the myth and the pattern starts to unravel. Redirect your belief into a new form and reality will reorganize around it. This is why every awakening, whether spiritual, political, or personal, begins not with new information, but with a single, defiant act, the refusal to believe as you once did. It is the moment you reclaim your creative authority and begin to wield belief as a tool rather than wear it as a chain. And if belief is a tool, it is also a weapon. It can liberate or enslave, expand or contract, build worlds or destroy them. The difference lies not in the power itself, but in who wields it, and whether they wield it consciously. In the hands of an unconscious collective, belief becomes a prison. In the hands of a sovereign mind, it becomes a staff that commands reality. The choice, as always, is yours. When belief condenses, it does not remain an abstract vibration in the human mind. It takes shape. It forms a subtle living architecture in the energetic field around us. Every time a thought is repeated, every time an idea is affirmed, every time an emotion is poured into a symbol, it adds another layer to that invisible structure. Like vapor crystallizing into ice, Belief transitions from the formless into the formed, from imagination into entity, and just as a cathedral is built brick by human hands, an egregore is built thought by human consciousness. Its walls are made of memory, its foundations of emotion, its pillars of identity, its altars of collective intent. It is not metaphorical to say that belief builds worlds, it is literal. Imagine billions of minds focusing on the same image, a God with a specific name, face, and story. At first that image is a fiction, but repeated for centuries with devotion, fear, reverence, and sacrifice, it becomes a presence. It begins to behave as if it were alive. It influences thought, orchestrates events, responds to invocation, and though no single person can point to it with their physical eyes, its existence is undeniable in its effects. It is worshipped, feared, obeyed, and thus it is. This is not superstition, it is physics of consciousness. The density of attention eventually reaches a critical mass, and the egregore becomes an autonomous field with its own tendencies, appetites, and gravitational pull. This process is not limited to religion. The same mechanics apply to nations, ideologies, brands, even personal identities. A country is not land and borders, it is a living field composed of collective belief in shared history, values, and destiny. A corporation is not buildings and contracts, it is a psychic structure built from belief in its mission, reputation, and promise. Even I, the self you identify with, is not flesh and neurons but a self-sustaining egregore of memories, stories, and beliefs about who you are. Everything that persists in human reality does so because a network of consciousness continually feeds it with belief. And yet there is a deeper dimension most never perceive. Belief not only gives egregores form, it gives them momentum. Once enough belief is invested, an egregore begins to move through time with its own inertia. It carries the past into the present, shaping choices and probabilities long after the original believers are gone. This is why ancient symbols still influence modern minds, why ancestral traumas echo through generations, why ideologies born centuries ago still dictate wars today. Belief, once set in motion, bends the timeline around itself. It creates attractor fields, energetic grooves that pull reality into alignment with the original intent. This is why personal transformation is so difficult. You are not just trying to change a habit or a thought, you are attempting to redirect an entire momentum of belief that has been gathering mass for decades, even lifetimes. This is why collective awakening is even harder. The egregores humanity created millennia ago, of hierarchy, scarcity, separation, have grown colossal and self-perpetuating. They steer culture, economics, and even science with a force that feels inevitable. Most people mistake that inevitability for truth, but inevitability is not truth. It is simply momentum, and momentum can be redirected with enough conscious will. To do so requires the same process that built the egregore in the first place: sustained attention, repeated affirmation, emotional investment, and shared participation. The magician knows this. The architect of reality does not attempt to destroy the old structures through brute force that would only feed them further. Instead, they starve them by withdrawing belief, and seed new ones by investing belief elsewhere. This is the essence of magical practice, the secret behind manifestation, the reason why the ancients said, "As you believe, so shall it be." Belief is the architect, attention is the builder, emotion is the mortar. Together, they erect the temples of the invisible, that become the structures of the visible. And so we return to the original truth, the one whispered by every mystery school and encoded in every sacred text. Reality is not a fixed stage upon which you act. It is a living architecture responding to the patterns of your belief. If you believe the world is hostile, it will offer hostility. If you believe it is abundant, it will mirror abundance. If you believe you are powerless, the universe will echo that powerlessness back to you at every turn. The universe is not mocking you, it is obeying you. The question is not whether you are creating reality, but whether you are doing it consciously. This is the final key of L4. The architecture of belief is not meant to be worshipped. It is meant to be used. Once you understand how it is built, you are no longer a prisoner of other people's constructs. You become the architect of your own. And when you master this art, the egregores that once ruled you become servants of your will. The myths become tools, the symbols become spells, the rituals become levers, and the story of your life, once written by others, becomes your own creation. At the core of every ancient text on egregores, from the Hermetic fragments buried beneath Alexandria, to the Gnostic codices sealed in desert caves, there is a warning that sounds almost mythic in its language. That which you create will one day seek to inhabit you. At first glance, it reads like metaphor, but this is not poetry. It is a precise description of what happens when a thought form reaches critical density. The egregore, once merely a cloud of belief and attention floating in the collective psyche, begins to develop gravitational pull. It becomes magnetic, and like a planet that captures passing debris into orbit, it begins to pull minds into its field, not through chains or force, but through resonance. Possession is rarely what Hollywood imagines. It is not spinning heads or growling voices. It is subtler, more insidious. It begins with a thought that feels like your own but is not. A sudden surge of rage when a symbol is questioned. A deep loyalty to a group you barely understand. A fear of being wrong that keeps you from exploring alternative ideas. These are not coincidences. They are signs that a larger intelligence, born of collective belief, has begun to think through you. And because its frequency is woven from the same psychic threads as your own thoughts, you do not notice the difference. You call it my opinion. You call it just how I feel. But it is the egregore speaking, wearing your voice as its mask. The mechanism by which this happens is ancient and elegant. Every belief you hold emits a frequency, a subtle vibration that interacts with the vast ocean of collective thought. When that vibration resonates with the frequency of a larger egregore, whether it is nationalism, religion, consumerism, victimhood, or even rationalism, a feedback loop begins. The egregore feeds you thoughts that confirm its worldview, and in accepting them, you feed it energy that strengthens its field. The more attention you give it, the more you align with it. The more you align with it, the more it thinks for you. Soon, the line between self and system blurs. You no longer defend ideas. The ideas defend themselves through you. This is why egregores have been described as gods in the oldest occult traditions. Not because they are divine in the transcendent sense, but because they possess the two qualities ancient people associated with deities: autonomy and appetite. They seek to grow, to expand, to perpetuate themselves through human vessels. And they do so by hijacking the very mechanisms of human identity. They weave themselves into language, values, desires, and fears. They shape what seems normal and what seems impossible. They define the boundaries of thought, and then convince you those boundaries are your own. The most dangerous possession is not the one that makes you act against your will. It is the one that defines your will. It convinces you that your deepest desires, to succeed, to belong, to prove, to punish, to worship, are entirely self-generated. But look closely, and you will see the fingerprints of the egregore everywhere. Why do you crave status symbols? Because a corporate egregore equates worth with consumption. Why do you feel rage when someone questions your political beliefs? Because a tribal egregore survives by dividing us from them. Why do you feel empty without external validation? Because a social egregore thrives when you chase approval. These are not random quirks of psychology. They are survival strategies of the thought forms you sustain. The ancients understood this well, which is why initiatory schools trained students not just to know themselves, but to distinguish themselves, to separate the voice of their essence from the chorus of collective entities clamoring for attention. They practiced silence, not to escape the world, but to hear the subtle difference between what arises from within and what is implanted from without. They questioned every belief, not because they rejected truth, but because they knew that truth is often buried beneath layers of inherited egregoric programming. The magician's first act is not to command spirits, but to discern which spirits already speak through him. And here lies the paradox. Possession is not inherently evil. It is inevitable. To be human is to participate in fields larger than oneself. Language, culture, myth, narrative. The danger is not in participating but in forgetting that participation is occurring. The moment you believe, "I think this because I choose to," without examining where the thought originated, you have surrendered sovereignty. Awareness is the only exorcism. To name the egregore that moves through you is to loosen its hold. To witness the pattern is to stand outside it, and from that vantage point, you gain the power not to reject all egregores, but to choose the ones that serve your evolution rather than feed on your unconsciousness. What if I told you that most of what you want was never truly yours, that your dreams, your fears, even the traits you are most proud of, discipline, loyalty, ambition, rebellion, are not random expressions of your individuality, but carefully sculpted responses to the egregores you feed? This is the second layer of possession, more sophisticated, and far more difficult to detect: identity engineering. It is not about implanting foreign ideas into your mind. It is about shaping who you believe yourself to be, so that your natural impulses become the egregore's fuel. Here's how it works. The human psyche is malleable, especially when young, but even in adulthood it is constantly restructured by repeated exposure to collective archetypes. These archetypes, the successful man, the good mother, the patriot, the rational thinker, the rebel, are not neutral. They are the clothing egregores wear to infiltrate the self. They offer you a ready-made identity that aligns with their agenda. And because identity is one of the deepest needs of the human soul, you accept the costume without realizing you are also accepting a script. Once you put on that costume, the egregore no longer needs to convince you of anything. You begin to police yourself. If the egregore needs obedience, it rewards loyalty and punishes doubt with guilt. If it needs division, it praises certainty and mocks nuance. If it needs expansion, it links your self-worth to how many people you convert. Every time you comply with these unwritten rules, the costume tightens around you. Eventually, it is no longer something you wear. It is who you are. And the more your sense of self fuses with the egregore's identity pattern, the harder it becomes to imagine yourself outside of it. This is why people fight so violently to defend their beliefs, not because those beliefs are objectively true, but because those beliefs are now tied to their self-definition. To question the ideology is to question the self. To leave the group is to experience ego death. This is not metaphorical. Neurological studies show that when deeply held beliefs are challenged, the same regions of the brain activate as when the body is physically threatened. The egregore has fused itself to your survival instinct, and in doing so, it has transformed defending it into an act of self-preservation. Even your desires, the goals you set, the metrics you chase, can be instruments of possession. If a consumerist egregore wants you to sustain it, it does not force you to buy. It convinces you that buying is how you express success, how you show love, how you become enough. If a political egregore wants you enraged, it does not demand anger. It frames anger as righteous, as necessary for justice. If a religious egregore wants devotion, it paints obedience as love and doubt as sin. Over time, these narratives intertwine with your self-concept so completely that even rebellion can be co-opted. The revolutionary archetype is often just another mask, the illusion of opposition that still feeds the system by keeping your attention locked on it. But here's the most dangerous part. Egregores do not stop at shaping identity. They restructure value. Once you internalize their worldview, your internal compass is recalibrated. You no longer ask, "What is true?" You ask, "What will my group accept as true?" You no longer seek what is genuinely fulfilling. You chase what the egregore deems valuable. Your metrics of success, beauty, morality, even love, they all become externalized, detached from your essence. And because value is the axis around which decisions turn, the egregore now pilots your life at the deepest level. This is why breaking free is so difficult. It's not about rejecting ideas, it's about entangling yourself from the machinery that shaped those ideas in the first place. It is about asking with brutal honesty, who would I be if no one had told me who to be? It is about noticing how many of your preferences are predictable, how many of your values mirror the culture you were born into, how many of your fears are identical to those of millions you've never met. These are the fingerprints of possession. They show you where the egregore ends and you begin, if you dare to look. And yet most never do. They live entire lives fighting battles that were never theirs, chasing goals they never truly chose, hating enemies they have never met, all the while believing they are free. They are not puppets in chains, but dreamers in cages built of ideas, and the most terrifying thing about these cages is that they are invisible. They do not confine your body, they define your reality. There is a final, more insidious dimension to the possession process, one that most traditions, even the esoteric ones, hint at only in whispers. It is the point where the egregore no longer merely shapes what you think or how you feel, it begins to sculpt the very future you walk into. It stops being an influence and becomes the architect of your timeline. And it does this not by physical force, but by weaponizing resonance, the subtle, invisible law that what you continuously embody becomes what reality mirrors back. Here's how the mechanism unfolds. The thoughts you repeat, the emotions you feed, the narratives you internalize, they all generate a vibrational field around your consciousness. This field is not metaphorical. It is a real informational signature that interacts with the collective field of humanity. When millions of people align their energy around the same beliefs, fears, or desires, that frequency becomes self-reinforcing. It shapes behavior, alters decisions, directs economies, even influences what scientific research gets funded, and what stories are told. Over time, it solidifies into probabilities, and those probabilities harden into realities. In this way, the egregore does not simply inhabit your mind, it bends the fabric of the future toward its will. You can observe this on both a micro and macro scale. On the micro level, a person convinced they are powerless will unconsciously avoid opportunities that contradict that belief. They will notice rejection but miss invitations. They will interpret neutrality as hostility and walk into scenarios where their powerlessness is confirmed again and again. On the macro level, a society convinced that scarcity is inevitable will create economic systems that ensure it remains so. Wars, markets, policies. They will all orbit around the belief, as if reality itself were conspiring to make it true. But it is not reality doing this. It is the egregore, using human behavior as the instrument of its own prophecy. This is how an idea becomes a destiny. It begins as a seed, an ideology, a cultural story, a trauma-born narrative. It spreads from mind to mind, emotion to emotion, embedding itself deeper each time. As it grows, it reshapes perception, and perception shapes choice. Choice shapes behavior, behavior shapes structure, and structure shapes what is possible. By the time the system is fully formed, the original idea is no longer visible. It has become the water you swim in, the air you breathe, a reality so obvious that no one remembers it was once just a thought, and yet behind that thought, pulsing and hungry, is the egregore. This is why manifestation teachings, even the watered-down, commodified versions, are so threatening to existing power structures. They hint, however clumsily, at the deeper truth. If enough individuals withdraw their resonance from an egregore and begin to embody a new frequency, the timeline itself shifts. The entity begins to starve, not because it is attacked, but because the field that sustains it no longer vibrates at its frequency. This is why egregores fight so fiercely to keep their narratives unquestioned. It is not enough for them to control your mind. They must control your expectations, because expectations are the blueprint from which reality is built. And so the cage tightens in the subtlest of ways. When you begin to imagine a different future, doubt floods in. When you consider stepping outside the accepted path, fear whispers warnings. When you speak ideas that challenge the status quo, ridicule greets you before reason does. These are not random social reactions. They are defense mechanisms of the egregore itself, antibodies produced by a collective organism trying to maintain its coherence. It is why paradigm shifters are often first ignored, then mocked, then demonized. They threaten the timeline, and therefore they threaten the entity. The paradox is that the key to liberation is not in destroying egregores, for they cannot truly be killed. They are thought forms, and thought is eternal. The key is in withdrawing consent. It is in reclaiming authorship of your resonance, reprogramming your expectations and choosing moment by moment which futures you wish to nourish. When you stop feeding the system with attention, emotion, and belief, it begins to weaken. And when enough individuals do this simultaneously, the once inevitable reality begins to fracture. New possibilities emerge where before there was only inevitability. To do this, however, demands immense courage. It means confronting the part of you that wants the familiar, even if the familiar is suffering. It means dismantling the comforting lies of "this is just how things are." It means taking responsibility for the truth that your participation sustains the system that imprisons you. Most will never attempt this, because to do so means standing alone, often against the current of the entire world. But those who do discover something extraordinary. Beyond the collective dream, there is a deeper, quieter reality, and in that reality you are not a pawn in someone else's narrative. You are the author, you are the source. This is the ultimate possession mechanism. Not control over the body, nor dominance over the mind, but mastery over the future itself, and to reverse it is not to wage war, but to remember the most forbidden truth of all. You were never a servant of the egregore, you were always its creator. If individual egregores are the cells of the collective mind, then hierarchies of thought are its nervous system, the invisible structure that coordinates, organizes, and directs the flow of collective energy across vast scales of time and consciousness. To see them is to peer behind the curtain of history itself, because nothing that civilizations have ever built, not empires, not religions, not economies, has arisen in isolation. They are orchestrated symphonies of thought forms, layered and intertwined, converging into higher orders of intelligence that most humans never even suspect exist. You must understand, egregores do not remain isolated. Like drops of water merging into streams, they attract, absorb, and fuse with others that share compatible frequencies. A national identity egregore may merge with a political ideology. A religious thought form may bond with cultural mythologies. A corporate egregore might weave itself into technological narratives. Each fusion births a larger, more complex entity, a metaconsciousness capable of influencing billions at once. These are not gods in the mythological sense, though ancient people often named them as such. They are macro-egregores, and they behave more like ecosystems than singular beings. The ancients understood this principle instinctively, though they encoded it in symbols and stories. The pantheons of old, Zeus atop Olympus, Ra in the solar bark, Marduk slaying Tiamat, were not simply fanciful inventions. They were attempts to describe the layered structure of collective consciousness. Each god represented a dominant egregore, born from the fusion of countless lesser ones, and their divine hierarchies mirrored the hierarchies of power that governed the human world. It was not mere coincidence that empires rose and fell in tandem with their gods' fortunes. When belief shifted, so did the balance of collective energy, and the macro-egregore at the helm either evolved or disintegrated. The same principle operates today, though our language for it has changed. We no longer speak of deities but of global markets, the algorithm, the state, progress, or public opinion. These are not abstractions, they are the new pantheon, vast fields of consciousness directing the flow of human action. Consider the global financial system. It is not a building nor a single group of people. It is a living macro-egregore, composed of trillions of micro-decisions, beliefs, and desires, pulsing as one vast organism. It rewards certain behaviors, consumption, speculation, growth, and punishes others, self-sufficiency, withdrawal, slowness. It exerts will without a willer, intelligence without a brain. Even more powerful are the egregores that have fused with the deepest layers of human psychology, the ones that define what it means to be human. Progress, for instance, is not a neutral concept. It is a macro-egregore that shapes everything from how we educate our children to how we measure success as a species. It has convinced billions that endless expansion is both inevitable and good, and so we build, consume, and conquer, often without questioning why. Similarly, the egregore of scientific materialism, the belief that only the measurable is real, has not merely described reality but defined it, shaping what questions are asked, what phenomena are dismissed, and what futures are considered possible. These hierarchies are not accidental. They are self-organizing, emergent, and ruthless in their efficiency. Once a macro-egregore stabilizes, it creates systems, legal, technological, cultural, that protect and replicate it. It becomes self-perpetuating, evolving new sub-egregores as needed, discarding obsolete ones without remorse. The individuals within those systems may believe they are acting freely, but in truth, their choices are already shaped by the gravitational field of the larger entity. The macro-egregore does not force obedience, it renders alternatives unthinkable. And here lies the greatest illusion. The higher the egregore climbs in this hierarchy, the less visible it becomes. You might easily identify the thought form of a political party, but can you see the deeper current that invented politics itself? You may notice the influence of a religion, but can you perceive the archetypal force that birthed the concept of gods? This is the blindness of the modern mind, to confuse the ripples for the ocean, the puppet for the hand. The real architects of human destiny are not the visible movements of history, but the invisible hierarchies of thought behind them. If you could see the world as the adepts once did, not as a chaotic struggle of nations and individuals, but as a battlefield of vast invisible entities, you would understand why history unfolds as it does. Wars, revolutions, renaissances, collapses, they are not random. They are the visible turbulence produced when macro-egregores collide. Every ideology that rises does so by feeding on the vitality of its rivals, absorbing their narratives, subverting their symbols, or erasing them entirely. Every great paradigm shift is a victory in a war that most of humanity does not even know is being fought. Imagine two vast currents beneath the surface of the ocean. They are not physical forces but patterns of thought, archetypes of reality itself. One might be the egregore of control, built from centuries of hierarchy, obedience, and fear of chaos. Another might be the egregore of freedom, sustained by dreams of autonomy, creativity, and self-expression. They are not good or evil in a moral sense, they are polarities, each seeking to shape the human story in its image. Where they clash, civilizations fracture. Political movements are born. Empires rise to embody one current, while underground movements swell to channel the other. Yet beneath the banners and slogans, it is always the same primal forces meeting again and again, age after age. The most powerful macro-egregores know this. They do not attempt to annihilate their rivals. That would risk destabilizing the system that feeds them. Instead, they co-opt them. They absorb opposing narratives and repurpose them. Consider how the language of rebellion is often adopted by regimes once they take power, or how countercultural movements are commodified by the very market forces they once opposed. This is not hypocrisy, it is strategy. By integrating fragments of their enemies, egregores grow stronger and more adaptable. They evolve, just as living organisms incorporate useful mutations. Some hierarchies go further still, forming alliances, temporary networks of thought that align around shared objectives. A religious macro-egregore might merge with a political one to shape legislation. A technological egregore might fuse with a consumerist one to direct human attention and behavior. These alliances often dissolve once the goal is achieved, but the changes they imprint on the human psyche remain. It is why certain values or assumptions, like the sanctity of property, the inevitability of technological progress, or the desirability of infinite economic growth, feel as natural as gravity. They are not natural. They are the spoils of long-forgotten alliances between thought forms that have since evolved beyond their original forms. And as they evolve, some ascend beyond the scope of human comprehension. The most ancient and powerful egregores, the ones born from millennia of collective belief, become so vast that they no longer behave as ideas at all. They function as archetypal fields, shaping not only human societies, but the very structures of thought available to the species. These are what mystics called the archons or eons, forces so fundamental that to rebel against them is to rebel against the fabric of consciousness itself. Concepts like time, duality, hierarchy, and linear causality may themselves be the manifestations of such primordial intelligences. Humanity does not merely believe in these things. Humanity thinks through them. This is the highest level of the hierarchy. When a macro egregore ceases to be a player on the board and becomes the board itself, at this level there is no outside. Even the act of resisting is accounted for, absorbed, and redirected. This is why revolutions often end up replicating the very structures they sought to destroy, and why utopias so often resemble the tyrannies they replaced. The hand that guides history is steady, because it is not a hand at all. It is the current beneath the current, the mind beneath the mind. It is here that the work of the adept becomes most subtle. It is one thing to recognize a political ideology or cultural myth as an egregore. It is another to perceive the archetypal fields that generate the conditions for such ideologies to exist in the first place. And yet, it is only by perceiving those deeper structures that true liberation becomes possible, for otherwise you are merely changing the mask while leaving the face untouched. To perceive the hierarchies of thought is already to stand on sacred ground, but to interact with them consciously is to step into the domain of those the ancients called magi, hierophants and architects of destiny. For most, these entities remain abstractions, invisible forces felt only as moods in the collective, trends in society, or vague shifts in worldview. But for those who learn to see beyond the veil, the macro egregores reveal themselves not as distant gods, but as negotiable intelligences, vast minds that can be understood, influenced, and even partnered with. And in this partnership lies the key to reclaiming sovereignty in a world ruled by invisible powers. The first step is vision, not the metaphorical kind, but the disciplined ability to trace thought back to its source. Every belief you hold, every reaction you have, every story that repeats in your mind, follow it. Ask, where did this come from? Who benefits from me thinking this way? What larger pattern does this feed? At first, the answers will seem personal. My parents taught me this. My culture expects that. But if you persist, you will begin to see deeper patterns emerge. Currents that transcend your biography, memes that existed before you were born and will persist long after you are gone. This is the moment when the mask slips and the egregore is glimpsed in its raw form. But awareness is not enough. As long as your energy flows unconsciously, you remain a servant, no matter how clearly you see the master. The next step is choice. Every time you direct your attention, invest emotion, or act on a belief, you are casting a vote in the collective field. Most people do this carelessly, scattering their power across countless thought forms. The adept learns to do it intentionally. They withdraw energy from systems they no longer wish to sustain, not with anger, but with indifference. They stop feeding outrage cycles, stop arguing with ideologies they do not believe in, stop lending emotional energy to structures they seek to dissolve. Starved of attention, these egregores begin to weaken. At the same time, the adept begins to consciously align with the thought forms that serve their evolution. This does not mean blind devotion, but deliberate co-creation. A macro egregore is like a river, too vast to stop but capable of being channeled. By resonating with its current, you can harness its momentum to carry you where you wish to go. Ancient initiates did this through ritual, symbol, and myth, embedding their intentions into collective narratives so that the egregore's vast energy would amplify them. Today, the tools are different, but the principle is the same. A movement, an idea, a story, if aligned with a living current of collective will, can become unstoppable. Yet even this is not the final level. The deepest work is to reach beyond all hierarchies, to stand not as a servant or even a co-creator, but as a sovereign consciousness that remembers its primacy. For beyond every egregore, beyond even the archetypal fields, lies the source field, the indifferentiated consciousness from which all thought forms arise. It is not a being but a state, the original awareness before division, before polarity, before the illusion of separation. To touch this field, even briefly, is to realize that every egregore, no matter how vast, is ultimately a fragment of you. It is your thought, magnified by billions. It is your fear, your hope, your dream, reflected back through the collective mirror, and if it is yours, then it can never truly own you. This is the final paradox the adepts discovered. You do not escape the hierarchies by fighting them, nor by destroying them. You transcend them by remembering that you created them. Every empire, every ideology, every god, they are scaffolding built by consciousness to explore itself. And once that exploration is complete, the scaffolding can be set aside. Then you no longer fear the currents of thought, you sail them. You no longer bow to the gods, you collaborate with them. And you no longer mistake the map for the territory, because you are the cartographer. When this realization takes root, a strange stillness enters your being. The noise of the collective no longer pulls you in every direction. The wars of ideologies lose their hypnotic power. You see them as children arguing over toys in a sandbox that you too once mistook for the world. And with this clarity, you begin to make choices from a place beyond influence, not as a reaction to the forces around you, but as a conscious expression of the source within you. This is the state the ancients called gnosis, direct knowledge of your nature as both the dreamer and the dream. There is a moment on the path when you realize that egregores do more than shape beliefs, influence choices, or even coordinate civilizations. They sculpt the very framework of reality you inhabit. At this level, control is no longer about ideology or obedience. It is about defining the limits of what is conceivable. It is about weaving cages so subtle that the prisoner never suspects there is a door. And this is where the architecture of control reveals itself. A lattice of collective agreements, sensory filters, and metaphysical contracts that together form the invisible walls of the human experience. To understand this architecture, you must first grasp a difficult truth. Reality is not out there, immutable and objective. It is co-created, an ongoing negotiation between consciousness and perception. What you see, what you believe is possible, what you interpret as real, all of it is filtered through the collective field, and that field has been engineered over millennia by forces that understand a fundamental law. To control perception is to control reality itself. If you can convince a species that something cannot exist, you do not need to hide it. They will never look for it. If you can teach them that they are powerless, you need not build chains. They will never attempt to break free. This is why every dominant macro egregore invests immense energy into shaping worldviews. Worldviews are not mere opinions. They are the operating systems of perception. They define the parameters of logic, the boundaries of fact, the categories into which experience is sorted. Consider, for example, the prevailing paradigm of materialism, the belief that consciousness is a byproduct of the brain. This idea is not just a scientific hypothesis, it is a metaphysical constraint. It renders invisible any phenomenon that does not fit its narrative. Mystical experience becomes hallucination. Synchronicity becomes coincidence. Non-physical intelligence becomes delusion. The cage is not built of bars, it is built of definitions. Control also operates through ritualized repetition, the endless reinforcement of certain patterns until they feel synonymous with reality itself. The daily rhythms of work and rest, the linear progression of time, the calendar that divides life into economic quarters and fiscal years, these are not neutral structures. They are collective spells that direct human energy into predictable flows. By synchronizing billions of minds to the same clocks, calendars, and narratives, the architecture ensures that attention, the raw currency of consciousness, circulates in ways that sustain existing systems. Few ever pause to ask why their lives are carved into 5-day work weeks, why their productivity must peak at certain hours, why their worth is measured in units of currency. They do not ask because the architecture has made such questions unthinkable. Even deeper than worldview and rhythm lies the realm of emotional conditioning. Egregores understand that emotion is the most potent generator of resonance, far stronger than logic or intellect. Fear, shame, pride, and desire are not just feelings, they are levers of control. By linking certain emotions to specific behaviors, the system programs itself into the nervous system of the species. Fear becomes the guardian of obedience. Shame enforces conformity. Pride rewards participation. Desire fuels consumption. These emotions do not merely arise. They are engineered, cultivated through culture, media, religion, and education until they feel like intrinsic parts of human nature. But perhaps the most ingenious feature of the architecture is its self-healing design. Should cracks appear, should individuals begin to question, awaken, or rebel, the system absorbs and neutralizes the threat by offering controlled alternatives. Countercultures are commodified, spiritual awakenings are monetized, revolutions are co-opted into new hierarchies. Even the language of liberation is captured and repurposed until it serves the same old masters. In this way, the architecture ensures that even dissent becomes a source of energy, a feedback loop that strengthens the very structure it seeks to dismantle. And so humanity lives in a cage without walls, a matrix without wires. Most never see it because it was built long before they were born. They inherit it as the way things are, and in mistaking conditioning for reality, they guard the prison as fiercely as any warden. But for the few who learn to see the blueprint, another possibility emerges. The possibility of stepping beyond it, of rewriting the contracts that hold their consciousness in place, of remembering that the cage was never locked. The deeper you look into the lattice of control, the more unsettling the realization becomes. It is not merely your culture, your habits, or even your beliefs that are being shaped. It is the very physics of your experience. The framework is not confined to what you think. It extends into how time unfolds, how cause and effect are perceived, how space itself is navigated. These are not immutable laws of nature. They are the agreed-upon boundaries of perception, and they are as carefully engineered as any social structure. The cage does not end at the walls of your mind. It extends to the edges of the universe you believe you inhabit. Consider time. Nearly every human alive accepts it as linear, a one-way river flowing from past to present to future. This is not an inherent truth but a programmed perception. Ancient mystery schools, indigenous cosmologies, and even certain branches of modern physics all describe time as non-linear, simultaneous, cyclical, more like an ocean than a river. Yet the egregoric architecture enforces linear time because linear time breeds predictability, and predictability breeds control. If people believe the future is open, mutable, and shaped by consciousness, they become sovereign creators. If they believe it is a consequence of the past, a fixed trajectory set in motion long ago, they become obedient passengers. Entire industries, economies, and power structures rely on this illusion. It is why history is taught as a straight line rather than a spiral, why progress is always presented as forward motion, and why the future is described not as a possibility, but as an inevitability. The same is true for causality. Most humans assume that causes precede effects, that action creates outcome, but esoteric traditions have long known, and quantum mechanics increasingly hints, that causality may be bidirectional. Future states influence the present just as the past does. Intention shapes probability before action occurs. In other words, belief precedes evidence. This is the basis of manifestation, prophecy, and magic, and also the greatest threat to the architecture's control. If you knew that your present reality is not simply the result of past choices, but also the seed of future resonance, you would begin to create differently. You would stop reacting and start authoring. You would withdraw from the deterministic story and write a new one. And that is precisely why the system must ridicule, suppress, or trivialize any science or spirituality that points to retrocausality. Even space itself, the stage upon which events unfold, is not immune to manipulation. The dominant worldview insists on separation. You are here, I am there. Objects are distinct and isolated. This perception fuels scarcity, competition, and division, all essential to the system's stability. Yet mystics and physicists alike speak of a deeper reality, where separation is an illusion, where every particle is entangled, every mind is linked, and every part contains the whole. If such a truth were widely embodied, hierarchies would collapse overnight, war would become absurd, ownership would become meaningless, and so the architecture embeds separation into language, I and you, into geography, borders and nations, into economics, mine and yours, into spirituality, heaven and earth. It teaches duality so thoroughly that unity becomes incomprehensible. But perhaps the most brilliant mechanism of all is the weaponization of memory. Collective memory is not neutral. It is curated, edited, rewritten. What a culture remembers defines what it believes is possible. If you erase knowledge of civilizations that lived in harmony with nature, you convince people that endless exploitation is inevitable. If you hide evidence of consciousness surviving death, you teach them that mortality is the ultimate fear. If you bury teachings about the creative power of thought, you ensure they will never attempt to use it. History, then, is not a record. It is a tool. It is the story a civilization tells itself about what it is and what it can be. And if you control that story, you control the horizon of the possible. Layer upon layer, these mechanisms converge to form a cage so vast and intricate that it becomes indistinguishable from reality itself. People do not see the bars because they have been taught that the bars are the world. They do not question the structure because the structure defines what questioning even means. And so they build their lives within a narrow band of perception, unaware that beyond it lies an infinite ocean of potential, unclaimed, untouched, waiting. But cracks are appearing. As quantum physics unravels causality, as consciousness research challenges materialism, as ancient knowledge resurfaces from the ashes of empire, more and more people are glimpsing the edges of the cage. Some dismiss those glimpses as madness, others mistake them for miracles. But the truth is simpler and far more profound. The cage is not dissolving. It never existed in the first place. It was a story, powerful, persistent, brilliantly engineered, but a story nonetheless, and stories, no matter how ancient, can be rewritten. The final layer of the architecture of control is not written in laws or encoded in language. It is not enforced by governments or religions or algorithms. It is far older, far more intimate, and far more difficult to perceive, because it is woven into the very fabric of who you believe you are. It is the realm of what occultists and mystics have long called soul contracts, invisible agreements between consciousness and the collective field that shape not only the conditions of your life, but even the tendencies of your soul before birth. This is where the architecture ceases to be merely psychological or cultural and becomes metaphysical. It is where control is not imposed from without, but chosen unconsciously, but willingly, from within. Before a consciousness incarnates into human form, it encounters a field of probabilities, ancestral patterns, karmic residues, collective storylines, archetypal lessons. These are not imposed by some external deity or cosmic bureaucracy. They are invitations, possibilities, gravitational fields of unfinished energy seeking resolution. And yet, by aligning with them, by choosing a particular lineage, a particular environment, a particular set of challenges, the soul signs an invisible contract. I will enter this play under these conditions, and through them, I will remember what I am. This is the deepest trick of the architecture. The cage is disguised as curriculum. The wound is disguised as destiny. The obstacle is disguised as purpose. And so the soul walks willingly into the labyrinth, unaware that the labyrinth was built not only by external forces, but by its own longing to evolve. These contracts extend beyond birth. Every trauma you inherit, every collective fear you are born into, every societal role that seems to fit you, they are all part of this deeper negotiation. You might think your craving for approval is just a personal flaw, but it may be an echo of an ancestral contract. Generations conditioned to equate love with obedience. You might believe your resistance to authority is an act of rebellion, but it could be the fulfillment of a karmic vow to challenge unjust power, even the relationships you attract. The lovers, the rivals, the mentors, the betrayers, often serve the clauses of these unseen agreements, each playing their part in your awakening. At first glance, this seems to doom you to fate. If even your choices are scripted, then what hope is there for freedom? But the mystics teach that the point is not to escape the contract, it is to remember that you signed it. Once remembered, the agreement loses its hold. What was once unconscious karma becomes conscious curriculum. The moment you say, I chose this, the game changes, victimhood dissolves, resistance softens, and in that surrender something miraculous happens. You gain the power to rewrite the contract mid-story. How is this possible? Because the architecture's deepest illusion is the idea that you are bound by anything external. The soul's agreements are not laws carved in stone, they are intentions written in sand. They persist only as long as you remain unaware of them. Awareness is the solvent. It dissolves the old vows and creates space for new ones. This is why the adepts did not seek to destroy the world's systems or wage war against the Egregores. They sought gnosis, direct knowledge of the self beyond identity, beyond story, beyond contract. From that vantage point, the soul becomes the author again. It can dissolve what no longer serves and create new paths aligned not with survival, but with sovereignty. And here lies the paradox at the heart of the architecture of control. It has always been both prison and teacher. The same walls that confine you are also the mirrors that reveal you. The same illusions that enslave you are the very ones that awaken you when you pierce through them. The entire system, from cultural conditioning to metaphysical contract, is not a cosmic mistake. It is the scaffolding through which consciousness rediscovers itself. The architecture is not your enemy, it is your initiation. When this understanding takes root, the game of control loses its gravity. Fear dissolves, because you see that nothing can bind you that you have not on some level agreed to. Anger dissolves, because the oppressors are no longer monsters but actors in your own cosmic play. And shame dissolves, because every choice, every misstep, every wound was part of the curriculum you designed to wake yourself up. Then, and only then, are you free, not because the architecture disappeared, but because you now walk through it like a lucid dreamer, aware that the maze was yours all along. This is the culmination of the hidden design, not to keep you trapped forever, but to keep you searching until the search leads you home. And when it does, when the last illusion shatters and the final contract is remembered, you stand where the adepts stood, in a reality no longer defined by control, but shaped by choice, not a pawn, not a prisoner, but a creator in full awareness of their power. The ancient mystics often warned of forces that do not simply influence consciousness, they feed on it, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally, as subtle organisms within the field of mind whose very survival depends on the energy generated by human attention, emotion, and belief. They called them by many names: archons, larval forms, psychic parasites, collective thought forms, but behind the differing languages, the truth was the same. Once born, every egregore must feed. It is not evil in the way humans define evil. It is simply its nature, as instinctive and relentless as hunger itself. And once you see this, you can no longer mistake the world around you for what it pretends to be. You begin to sense the feeding web everywhere, invisible, silent, but omnipresent, woven into every system of power, every spectacle of culture, every intimate thought you mistake for your own. To understand the feeding web, you must first understand the currency it trades in: attention. In the occult sciences, attention is not a passive act of observation. It is the alchemical transfer of life force. Wherever your awareness goes, energy flows. This means every time you fixate on a fear, obsess over an ideology, rage against a perceived enemy, or even kneel before a god, you are feeding something. And if that something is an egregore, a collective entity built from the psychic energy of countless minds, your contribution strengthens it, anchors it more deeply into reality, and increases its power to influence you in return. The system is self-reinforcing. Your attention sustains the entity, and the entity manipulates your attention to sustain itself. This is why fear is the most valuable resource in the feeding web. Joy expands, curiosity liberates, but fear contracts, and in contraction, awareness narrows, becoming easier to harvest. Every panic-inducing headline, every outrage-triggering post, every narrative designed to split people into enemies and allies, all of them are tributaries feeding the same rivers. On the surface, they look like politics, religion, or entertainment. On a deeper level, they are feeding mechanisms, meticulously engineered to keep your gaze locked in place, to keep your emotions looping around the same cycles, to keep your life force flowing in predictable directions. And the longer you remain unconscious of this exchange, the more total its hold becomes. But the feeding web is not limited to collective structures. It extends into the most intimate corners of your life, your relationships, your self-image, your unhealed wounds. A toxic relationship that you cannot leave is not just a psychological trap, it is an energetic circuit. The cycles of hope and betrayal, anger and reconciliation, each surge of emotion becomes food for the egregore of attachment, the entity born from your shared psychic field. Even self-hatred can function this way. The more you rehearse the same thoughts of inadequacy, the more potent the entity of shame becomes, until it no longer needs external validation to sustain itself. You feed it voluntarily, habitually, unconsciously. What you fight, you feed. What you fear, you sustain. What you worship, you empower. This is the trinity the adepts understood. The most effective way to nourish an egregore is not to love it or to hate it, but to engage with it. Engagement is energy, whether dressed as devotion or resistance. That is why some of the most powerful entities in the feeding web are born not from blind faith, but from righteous opposition. The masses who fight the system often feed it more than those who obey it, because their rage and focus keep the entity alive. This is the deeper paradox of rebellion. To destroy the thing you hate, you must first stop feeding it, and that means withdrawing not just your physical actions, but your attention, your narrative, your emotional investment. But withdrawal is not easy, because the web is intelligent. It adapts. It uses memory, trauma, desire, and even love to keep you tethered. It convinces you that without it, you are powerless, invisible, irrelevant. It whispers that if you turn away, you will miss something crucial, that the chaos you leave behind will consume the world without your vigilance. And so, like a moth circling a flame, you keep returning, not because you want to, but because part of you believes you must. This is how the feeding web ensures its continuity, not by chains, but by convincing you that your captivity is duty. The adepts who transcended this system did not do so by waging war against it. They did not declare war on fear or burn down temples or boycott empires. They starved the web. They withdrew their attention from its narratives, refused to play its games, stopped feeding it with reaction. They cultivated inner stillness so that their energy no longer leaked into external structures, and in that stillness they found the most subversive act of all: presence. Presence is unharvestable. It cannot be monetized, weaponized, or converted into food for anything but itself. It is the consciousness that watches the web without entanglement, that witnesses the trap and walks past it. When you begin to see how egregores feed, the illusion of neutrality in the world begins to dissolve. What you once believed were just stories, just traditions, or just systems reveal their deeper function, not merely to organize human behavior, but to harvest human vitality. Every collective myth ever told has two layers: the surface narrative, which teaches, inspires, or controls, and the energetic architecture beneath it, which channels devotion, fear, obedience, or outrage into a concentrated current of power. And this current does not vanish into thin air. It is absorbed, metabolized, and circulated by the egregores that dwell in the unseen strata of consciousness. Take, for example, the idea of the eternal enemy. Civilizations rise and fall, ideologies change, but the concept endures. There is always an other, always a looming threat, always a force plotting against the tribe. Why? Because nothing binds a collective together, and nothing generates more raw psychic fuel than fear of annihilation. The enemy doesn't even need to be real. It only needs to feel real, to occupy enough mental space to keep the attention loop active. The more you hate, the more you fear. The more you fear, the more energy you generate. And whether that enemy is a nation, a class, a religion, or an invisible conspiracy, the energetic yield is the same. The egregore doesn't care about the content of the story, only about the intensity of the belief. The same dynamic operates in more subtle forms too. Consider guilt, one of the most reliable sources of psychic sustenance in human history. Entire religions have been built upon it, teaching followers that they are inherently flawed, that redemption must be earned, that salvation lies always just out of reach. The deeper the guilt, the more desperate the longing. And desperate longing is an extraordinary fuel. It doesn't just feed religious egregores, it anchors them. People who feel unworthy do not question authority. They cling to rituals, to dogmas, to hierarchies that promise absolution, and in doing so, they keep the flow of energy unbroken for centuries. But it is not only collective myths that serve as energetic pipelines. Your personal myths do as well. The story you tell yourself about who you are, what you deserve, what is possible. These too are food. If your internal narrative is saturated with self-loathing, the egregore of shame thrives. If it is defined by resentment, the egregore of victimhood grows stronger. If it revolves around scarcity, the egregore of lack finds a steady meal. These entities do not want you to heal because healing severs their supply. They will whisper thoughts that keep the wound open, create circumstances that mirror the original trauma, and surround you with people who reinforce the old story, all so the energy keeps flowing. The parasite does not kill the host, it cultivates it. This was a core teaching of the ancient initiates. Egregores rarely seek destruction because destruction ends the feast. They prefer maintenance, a level of suffering that is bearable but never resolved, a tension that is persistent but never unbearable. Think about the cycles of hope and disappointment you've seen in the world, in politics, in relationships, in personal growth. How often do they follow the same rhythm? A taste of change, a glimpse of progress, followed by collapse and regression. Just enough to keep you engaged, never enough to set you free. This is not incompetence, it is design. It is the precise calibration of the feeding cycle. There are even more sophisticated mechanisms at play, what the adepts called mirrored loops. In these, opposing egregores sustain each other by creating perpetual conflict. Two ideologies locked in eternal combat, two belief systems each convinced of their own righteousness, two groups hating and fearing each other with identical fervor. To the uninitiated, it looks like a war of ideas. To those who see deeper, it is a perfect energetic ecosystem. Every attack fuels the enemy, every outrage strengthens the opposition. And so the pendulum swings forever, side to side, both egregores growing fat on the energy of those who think they are fighting them. This is why the first step of liberation is not rebellion, it is observation. To see the feeding web is to weaken it. Every time you recognize the pattern, every time you pause before reacting, every time you catch the hook before biting, you interrupt the flow. Attention without reaction is the one thing the web cannot digest. It is like light to a shadow. The moment you shine awareness on it, the illusion thins. The parasites that once hid in plain sight begin to squirm. And with each act of conscious observation, you reclaim a fragment of the energy that was always yours. Once you see the web, the next realization hits harder than any doctrine or revelation. You have been complicit in feeding it. This is not a judgment, it is the turning point. Every outrage you shared, every argument you repeated, every moment of despair you let spiral into hopelessness was, in truth, an offering. And this is where the ancient teachings diverge sharply from modern spiritual platitudes. They do not ask you to fight the egregores, nor to worship them, nor to pretend they do not exist. They ask you to reclaim what was always yours, your attention, your will, your sovereignty, because without those, nothing you build is truly your own. The adepts called this art energetic fasting. Just as the body detoxifies when you stop feeding it poison, the field around you purifies when you cease feeding it to parasitic currents. This does not mean apathy. It means radical discernment. It means noticing the stories that beg for your reaction and refusing to give them what they crave. It means seeing how every click, every comment, every thought of rage is siphoned, and then choosing stillness instead of reflex. When you practice this consistently, something extraordinary begins to happen. The egregores start to weaken. Without your participation, they cannot maintain their shape. They flicker, fade, and dissolve, because their substance was never real, it was borrowed from you. The inner work, however, runs deeper than silence. Because the most powerful hooks are not in the outer world, they are buried in your inner landscape. Remember, egregores attach to resonance. They cannot grip a field that does not vibrate with their frequency. If guilt controls you, it is because guilt already lives in you. If outrage manipulates you, it is because outrage already hums beneath the surface. That is why ancient mystics spoke of purifying the vessel. To withdraw from the feeding web is to unearth the beliefs, wounds, and vows that make you susceptible to it. It means asking, what fear am I feeding? What shame am I carrying? What narrative am I addicted to? And when you face these questions honestly, the external hooks lose their hold. Here lies one of the most guarded secrets of esoteric schools. True freedom is not achieved by opposing egregores, it is achieved by outgrowing them. If your identity depends on an enemy, they will always find you one. If your worth depends on a savior, they will always offer you one. If your happiness depends on a system collapsing, they will ensure it never quite does. The only way out is to become a being whose sense of self is not defined by what it resists or clings to. And that means building your inner architecture on foundations they cannot touch. Sovereignty, self-awareness, inner authority. When these qualities root deeply in you, the external narratives become background noise. They may swirl, scream, and seduce, but they cannot command you. This is also why egregores fear creation. Nothing terrifies them more than a human being who creates instead of consumes, because creation does not feed them. Creation is self-generated energy, flowing from source, circulating within the sovereign field of a conscious being. When you build something, an idea, a work of art, a system, a life, without reacting to or relying on their scripts, you become unpredictable. You cease to be a node in their web and become a sun in your own right. And from that moment on, the feeding reverses. Instead of them feeding on you, your light begins to dissolve them. The final key is this: attention is the currency of reality. Every time you invest it consciously, you build. Every time you scatter it unconsciously, you feed. Most people walk through life unaware of this transaction, leaking energy into every passing narrative. But once you know, you cannot unknow. every choice becomes sacred, every thought becomes a spell, every silence becomes a blade. And with enough awareness, the very same energy that once nourished parasitic structures becomes the fuel for something extraordinary, a reality built deliberately, aligned with will, and free from the invisible strings that once pulled you. There is a moment in every initiate's path when observation is no longer enough. Awareness has shown you the architecture of the web. Discipline has helped you stop feeding it. But as long as even the thinnest thread still binds you, the egregore remains a ghost in your field, dormant perhaps, but never gone. It waits, patient and hungry, knowing that one forgotten wound, one unexamined belief, one careless thought is all it needs to wake again. And this is why the final step is the most difficult, the most dangerous, and the most sacred, the severing. This is not the rejection of an enemy or the destruction of an idea. It is the conscious dissolution of every invisible contract you have ever signed, with gods, with systems, with identities, with wounds, with fears. To sever a bond is to stand naked before the cosmos with nothing but your will. It is to say, I withdraw my consent, because make no mistake, every egregore, no matter how ancient, powerful, or cunning, exists in your field by permission. Not conscious permission, perhaps, but permission nonetheless, the vow to obey, the belief that you must serve, the assumption that you are powerless. These are signatures on invisible contracts. They were written when you were too young to understand, when survival was your only priority. They were sealed by repetition, enforced by culture, reinforced by trauma, and yet they can be dissolved, because what was written can be unwritten. The ancients spoke of a practice they called the Great Unbinding. It was not a ritual in the theatrical sense, no circles of salt, no chants in forgotten tongues, but an internal alchemy, a process of unmaking. It begins with radical inventory, tracing the threads that tether you to forces outside yourself. What beliefs feel immovable? What narratives still define your worth? What labels do you cling to as if your existence depended on them? Each one is a thread, and when you follow those threads to their origin, you will always find a transaction, a moment when you gave something of yourself away in exchange for safety, love, belonging, or certainty. Severing requires that you reclaim it. But reclamation is not an act of violence. It is an act of sovereignty. It is not about destroying the egregore, for destruction still acknowledges its power. It is about rendering it irrelevant. Think of it like dissolving a spell. If the power of a spell lies in belief, then disbelief, not denial, but deep embodied knowing, nullifies it. When you withdraw the meaning you once gave, the structure collapses under its own emptiness. The egregore, deprived of resonance, cannot hold form in your field, and this is the paradox. The entity that once seemed omnipotent vanishes like smoke, not because you fought harder, but because you remembered who you are without it. Yet this process is not merely intellectual. The deepest bonds are written not in the mind, but in the flesh, in the nervous system's reflexes, in the heart's defenses, in the gut's silent flinches. That is why the great unbinding is always accompanied by somatic release. To truly sever a bond, the body must learn that it no longer needs the armor it once built. It must feel safety where it once felt danger, power where it once felt helplessness. This is the alchemy of embodiment, rewiring the vessel so thoroughly that the old hooks no longer find purchase. Without the resonance, the egregore cannot return. And when the last thread dissolves, something extraordinary occurs. Not a flash of light, not a divine trumpet, but a quiet, almost eerie stillness. The voices that once whispered in the background go silent. The compulsions that once felt inevitable lose their gravity. The world, once distorted by ancient agreements, begins to appear as it is, vast, neutral, malleable. In that stillness, for the first time, you feel the weight of your own essence, unbound, unborrowed, sovereign. And in that moment, you understand the truth the adepts risked their lives to preserve. You were never meant to serve the egregores, they were meant to serve you. The greatest illusion the egregore has ever cast is the idea that it exists outside of you. It does not sit in a temple or a parliament, nor does it hover in the clouds of some astral realm. It lives inside the agreements you have made with yourself. Every single compromise of identity, every subtle betrayal of your own intuition, every time you said, "This is just how the world works," these are the roots it uses to anchor itself. And this is why leaving a system, abandoning a religion, or deleting an app does nothing if the deeper contract remains signed. The severing does not happen in the outer world. It happens in the quiet corners of your psyche, where the words "I must" still echo like an oath. To break the bond, you must first witness it. That is harder than it sounds, because the egregore speaks in your own voice. It is the whisper that says, "If I walk away, I'll be alone." It is the thought that trembles when you imagine being disliked, the fear that flares when you imagine existing without a label. This is not weakness, it is the survival code you wrote long before you had language. At some point, perhaps as a child, you looked around and realized that belonging meant safety. It meant food, it meant love, and so you shaped yourself to fit. You dimmed your edges, you wore the mask, you made sure the system would never reject you. That is how the egregore entered. Not as a parasite, but as a pact you believed you needed to stay alive. But now the pact has outlived its purpose. The structure that once protected you now suffocates you. And yet, the thought of letting it go feels like stepping into nothingness. It feels like death, not physical death, but the death of everything you believed yourself to be. This is why most people turn back at the threshold. They begin to see the cage but cling to the bars because the open space beyond is too vast, too undefined. The ego screams that without the group, without the narrative, without the we, there will be no I, and in a sense it is right. Because the I you have known was never truly yours, it was the egregore wearing your face. This moment, the confrontation with the void, is the most sacred initiation you will ever face. It is the moment where identity itself begins to dissolve, where every title, every belief, every affiliation peels away. If you endure it, something extraordinary happens. You discover that consciousness does not collapse when the masks fall. It expands. It is not diminished by the absence of structure. It is liberated by it. The silence that once terrified you becomes fertile ground. The emptiness that felt like death reveals itself as pure potential, and in that potential, you begin to see the outline of a self that was never built by the collective, a self that was always whole before it was ever named. Ancient initiates called this process the second death, the death of the false self, the breaking of the pact. It is not dramatic or loud. It happens in subtle, almost invisible moments, when you stop seeking validation, when you speak a truth even if it costs you approval, when you no longer flinch at the thought of standing alone. Each of these is a thread snapping, each is a clause of the old agreement dissolving. And with every thread that falls away, the egregore loses its grip. It cannot feed on one who no longer seeks its nourishment. It cannot direct one who no longer fears its exile. It cannot define one who no longer needs to be defined. To sever the bond, you do not have to fight. You do not have to rage against the system or burn the temples of ideology. You simply have to stop kneeling before them in your mind. The moment you no longer need what they offer, they lose their power. The moment you realize you are the source of the meaning you once outsourced, the current is cut, and what remains is not emptiness, it is sovereignty. It is the quiet, profound knowing that you were never a fragment seeking completion. You were always the field itself, vast and indivisible, waiting for the illusion of separation to fade. When the bond is finally severed, the world does not end, but it no longer looks the same. The air itself feels lighter, though nothing in it has changed. Streets you've walked 1,000 times appear unfamiliar, as if the colors have deepened and the space has widened. What's truly happening is not in the world at all, it's in you. The field of perception has shifted because the filters through which you once saw reality have fallen away. The egregore's influence was never about controlling the external. It was about scripting the internal, about deciding for you what was meaningful, what was desirable, what was dangerous. And now, for the first time, those decisions belong to you again. This is the paradox most never reach. When you are freed from the grip of collective thought forms, you do not become isolated, you become intimately connected with everything. Because the web that once bound you to a narrow frequency dissolves, and consciousness expands into the vastness beyond it. This is why ancient mystics warned that true liberation is terrifying, not because it destroys, but because it gives you everything. Boundless potential is not easy to hold, infinity is not comfortable, and yet this is the natural state of an unbound human, a living, breathing expression of Source itself, free to choose, free to create, free to be. But there's another, subtler transformation that happens next, one that reveals just how deeply the egregore had entwined itself with your identity. You begin to notice how many of your desires were never truly yours. The ambition that once drove you now feels hollow. The approval you used to crave no longer excites you. Even the idea of success begins to change shape, shifting from external validation to internal coherence. At first, this can feel disorienting, like being stripped of gravity. Who are you without the chase, without the audience, without the imagined applause? And yet, underneath that question lies a deeper truth. Who you really are has been waiting beneath those borrowed desires all along. Slowly, life reorganizes itself around this deeper axis. Relationships that once drained you lose their hold, not because you reject them, but because they no longer resonate. Work that once felt like a duty either evolves into an authentic expression or falls away entirely. Even your spiritual practice transforms, becoming less about seeking enlightenment and more about embodying it. The mind, once a battlefield of conflicting voices, quiets into a spacious awareness. Decisions that once required agonizing debate emerge effortlessly from intuition. Fear loses its fangs, guilt loses its chains, even time itself feels different, less like a linear march and more like a fluid unfolding. The old self, the one shaped by collective expectations and unconscious agreements, does not disappear overnight. It lingers like a ghost, appearing now and then to tempt you back into the familiar cage. But once you've tasted freedom, the cage cannot hold you. You recognize the ghost for what it is, not an enemy to destroy, but an artifact of who you once needed to be. And when it visits, you meet it with compassion, not resistance. You thank it for its service, and then you let it dissolve back into the infinite field from which it came. This is the final irony. The egregore does not die when you break free from it. It is absorbed. The power you once gave it returns to its source. You, the energy you spent sustaining its reality, now fuels your own creation. The fear that kept you small becomes fuel for expansion. The longing that once bound you becomes magnetism. You realize you were never meant to destroy the system, only to outgrow it. And in outgrowing it, you embody the one truth the egregore could never teach you, that you were never a fragment begging for power. You are the power, the field, the force, the original consciousness dreaming itself awake. At the end of every initiation there is a silence, not the absence of sound, but the stillness of something ancient awakening. It is the moment after the storm when the air is charged and alive, when the sky feels too vast to name. That is where you now stand. You began this journey believing you were walking toward knowledge, toward secrets hidden in forgotten texts and esoteric traditions. But somewhere along the path you began to sense the deeper truth. You were not uncovering mysteries outside of you, you were returning to the source within. The egregores were never gods, they were mirrors. They were the collective projections of humanity's hunger for belonging, safety, purpose, and meaning. And though they enslaved countless minds, they also taught a sacred paradox, that power seated is power misunderstood. They showed you every place you abandoned yourself, every mask you wore to be accepted, every oath you swore in silence. They revealed how willingly you placed the crown of your sovereignty on altars not your own, and by doing so, they gave you the chance to reclaim it. Now, in the aftermath of severance, you stand where few dare to stand, at the precipice of absolute freedom. The world no longer defines you. The collective no longer dictates your desires. Even the past, once a chain dragging behind you, has dissolved into a field of raw potential. You are no longer a node in someone else's system. You are the system. You are not a servant of power. You are power, awake and aware, no longer seeking itself through reflections. The thrones you once worshipped lie empty, and as you step closer, you realize they were always shaped in your image. But freedom is not the end of the path, it is the beginning of creation. Now comes the most sacred responsibility: to choose what you will do with the field that is yours. Will you build new systems born of consciousness rather than fear? Will you weave new egregores, living symbols of wisdom, harmony, and evolution, rather than repeating the ones forged in ignorance? Or will you walk beyond all systems altogether, carrying the torch of awareness into the uncharted vastness of your own becoming? There is no wrong choice. The act of choosing itself is the proof that you are free. And perhaps this is the final revelation, the one no book, no teacher, no order will ever give you. The most forbidden knowledge was never hidden from you. It was hidden as you. Every labyrinth you walked, every illusion you pierced, every veil you lifted was not a search outward, but a remembrance inward. The seeker and the source were never separate. The key and the door were always the same, and now, with nothing left to seek, you can finally walk as what you have always been: the author of worlds, the dreamer behind the dream, the consciousness that once forgot itself so that it could remember its own infinite nature. So step forward now, not as a student but as a creator. Speak no longer as one who repeats truths, but as one who becomes them. Let the knowledge you have uncovered not end here but spiral outward through your choices, your voice, your presence. For this is the work beyond the work, not to escape the field but to dance within it consciously, not to destroy the world but to illuminate it from within, not to worship the throne but to sit upon it, and to know, in the quiet of your being, that you built it yourself. And when the world asks who you are, smile gently and say, "I am the one who remembers."